Rust on the gloss. The factory stood in the Midwest gray, like an old animal that had forgotten how to die. The sky pressed low. It promised rain and never delivered. Inside, the fans roared without pause. The sound entered the bones and stayed there. Steel dust settled on skin, on lips, into coffee. It tasted of salt and iron. Nolan worked beneath a strip of flickering light, 50 years in his shoulders. His hands smelled of burnt metal and tired oil. He spoke little. The machines had taken his words years ago. Sometimes he scraped dried paint from his nails with a welding rod. He thought of his son only in fragments. A bus station. A short goodbye. No letters. The siren screamed for 15 minutes of mercy. Not freedom, just a pause in the grinding. They sat on the concrete steps behind the wall, where the noise softened into a distant growl. Vike held her old thermos between her palms. The lid wobbled when she turned it. Nolan tried to light a cigarette. His fingers trembled from the vibration of the tools. The flame went out once, then again. She watched the smoke when it finally rose. They spoke about the weather. It meant nothing. The air between them meant more. A paper appeared on the notice board that morning. The plant would close in a month. No one shouted. Autumn comes. Metal cools. That is all. Nolan looked at Vike's profile while she read. She saw cracks in steel for a living. Microfractures no one else noticed. She did not look surprised. Outside these gates, they would be two strangers with heavy hands and nowhere to place them. The lid slipped from her thermos and rolled into the dirt beneath the steps. Nolan went down slowly. His knees cracked. He wiped the plastic on his coverall and handed it back. Their fingers touched for a second. Nothing followed. No promise. No plan for after. Steel dust clung to their lips. It was enough. The siren called them back. Nolan brushed his knees. Vike tightened the lid. The first drop of rain fell and cut a clean line through the dust on his cheek. They did not look at each other. They walked inside. The steps remained empty. The smell of wet asphalt rose into the gray. Tomorrow, there would be another shift. Morning entered the workshop without light. It was only a thinner shade of gray. The factory breathed in smoke and breathed out heat. Nolan stood at his station before the siren. He liked the minutes before the noise began. They felt almost honest. He ran a hand over the steel plate, as if it were an animal that needed combing. The surface was cold. It would not stay that way. The machines woke all at once. Sparks burst and died in the air. The smell of welding burned the throat. Nolan bent over the scene. His visor lowered. The world narrowed to a bright line, and the steady tremor in his wrists. When he lifted the mask, he saw Vike moving along the row, clipboard against her chest. She paused at each joint, tracing the metal with her gloved fingers. She searched for what others missed. A crack the size of a hair. A weakness that would spread. At noon, the siren tore through the hall again. They went outside without speaking. The sky had sunk lower. The air tasted of coming rain. Nolan held his cigarette, but did not light it. He turned it between his fingers, watching the paper crease. Vike poured coffee from the thermos. The lid clicked, loose and stubborn. Steam rose for a moment and vanished. "They'll sell the machines," she said. He nodded. He scraped rust from the railing with his thumbnail. It came off in small flakes and settled on his boot. "My son works in a place with glass walls," he said after a while. "So he wrote once." She looked at him then, not with pity, only with attention dot, as if he were a weld she needed to measure. The rain began without drama, a thin sheet that blurred the highway beyond the yard. They stayed until the siren called them back. Water dotted the steel steps. It mixed with dust and formed dark streaks. Inside, the noise swallowed them again. The seam waited. The crack waited. The day moved forward like a conveyor that could not be stopped. The days began to count themselves. Not loudly, Just a number written in chalk near the time clock. 23. Then 22. No one asked who wrote it. It felt official enough. Nolan touched the number each morning with the back of his finger, as if checking a bruise. The noise seemed sharper now. Every strike of metal carried an edge. Nolan welded without lifting his head. The scene glowed, then dulled. He thought of nothing while the torch burned. That was the only relief left to him. Vike moved slowly along the frames stacked near the wall. She marked small circles in red where the steel had tired before its time. Her pencil grew shorter each day. She kept it in the pocket of her gray coat like a fragile tool. At break, they sat on the steps again. The air smelled of oil and wet dust. Nolan finally lit the cigarette. The flame held this time. He offered it to her without looking. She shook her head and wrapped both hands around the thermos. The lid no longer sealed properly. A thin line of coffee had dried along the side, dark and sticky. They say the land will be sold, she said, double quotes, warehouses, maybe apartments. He watched the smoke drift toward the highway. People will sleep where we worked, she nodded. There was no anger in it, only a tired kind of wonder. A truck passed and sprayed water onto the yard. Mud crept toward the bottom step. Vike wiped her glasses with the edge of her sleeve. Nolan noticed a small cut on her knuckle. He reached into his pocket and handed her a folded rag. Their hands met again, brief, careful, like placing a fragile part into position. The siren called. They stood. Inside, someone had erased the chalk and written a new number, 21. The factory hummed as if it would never end. Nolan lowered his visor. Vike bent over a fresh seam. Outside, the rain kept falling on the rusted window panes, drawing thin lines that looked almost like cracks. The number by the clock fell to 15. Someone had stopped writing it neatly. The chalk broke. The digits leaned to one side, as if tired of standing. Nolan watched a young worker rub them out with his sleeve and write the new count without comment. It felt like adjusting a machine that no longer mattered. Inside, the air grew thicker each day. Fewer orders, fewer sparks. The pauses between tasks stretched. Nolan cleaned his welding tip longer than necessary. He lined up his tools in a straight row on the metal table. The surface was scarred from years of heat. He ran a finger over the grooves. They felt like memory, hard, permanent. Vike inspected a shipment that would never leave. She moved her lamp closer to the joints. The light revealed tiny imperfections in the cooling steel. She marked them anyway, though no one asked her to. Habit was stronger than instruction. When she closed her clipboard, the sound was final, like a door shutting in another building. At the break, the steps were damp. The rain had come earlier and left behind a smell of wet iron. Nolan did not bring a cigarette. He kept both hands empty. Vike poured coffee. It was weaker now. She had begun using less grounds. The lid slipped again. This time it cracked along the rim when it hit the concrete. They both looked at the small fracture in the plastic. She turned it in her fingers, studying it as if it were steel. Nolan took it gently. He pressed the pieces together. It held, but only barely. "It will last," he said. "For how long?" she asked. He did not answer. The siren cut through the yard before he could. They stood. He brushed rust from the railing with his palm. She tightened the broken lid with care. Inside, the hall echoed more than before. Empty space had begun to speak. Nolan lowered his visor. Vike leaned toward the seam. The light flared once, bright and brief, against the rusted glass of the high windows. The number fell to 7. No one erased it this time. It remained on the wall, crooked and faint, as if even chalk had grown tired. The hall felt larger now. Sound traveled farther before breaking apart. Some stations stood empty. Tools were missing. The air carried less heat. It carried more silence. Nolan arrived early. He stood by his table and looked at the hooks where helmets once hung. He wiped his visor with a cloth that smelled of oil. The glass was scratched from years of sparks. Through it, the world always seemed slightly damaged. He preferred it that way. It matched the inside of his chest. Vike walked the floor without her clipboard. She had left it in her locker. There were no more shipments to inspect. Only unfinished frames stacked near the far wall. She ran her bare fingers over a cooling seam and did not mark anything. It no longer mattered if the steel held. At break, they sat on the steps as before. The thermos lid showed a thin white line where the crack had spread. She turned it carefully, as if turning a fragile thought. Nolan held a cigarette between his fingers, but did not light it. The wind was stronger. It bent the smoke from a distant chimney sideways. "My son called," he said. The words seemed surprised to leave him. She waited. He asked if I would visit. "There's work there. Security at a warehouse." She nodded once. "Will you go?" He watched a truck move along the highway. It disappeared into a low band of fog. "I don't know." The siren sounded weaker now. Or perhaps their ears had grown used to it. They stood. This time, when they reached the door, their shoulders brushed. Neither stepped away. It was not a gesture. Only a narrow entrance and two tired bodies. Inside, the machines started again. Fewer sparks, shorter seams. Nolan lowered his visor and saw the bright line cut through steel one more time. Vike stood nearby without writing anything down. Outside, rain gathered on the rusted windows and began to slide, slow and steady, toward the edge. Acceptable, morning stood still over the small Ohio town like a damp sheet left too long on a line. The main street ended at the locked gates of the tire factory, its windows blind with dust. At the edge of the lot, the cheap motel Blue Star blinked unevenly. The neon S crackled, died, and returned with a tired pulse. Lucas stood at the entrance, looking down at his shoes. The snow on them was no longer white. It had taken in gravel, salt, and the thin oil from the road. He scraped the soles against the concrete step, but the dirt only pressed deeper into the leather, as if it preferred to stay. At Joe's Diner, the coffee tasted boiled and overused, but it was hot, and that was enough. Lucas held the cup with both hands. Outside, a truck stopped along the highway. The driver stepped down and wiped the windshield in a slow, practiced arc. Lucas watched the movement and felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen the same gesture 10 years ago on the other side of the ocean. The hand was the same. Only the sky had changed. In the kitchen, he turned on the hot water and let it run until steam filled the narrow space. Plates moved through his hands in a steady rhythm. He washed them carefully, almost clinically, as if precision could reduce the weight of the day. The water slid over porcelain and glass, but beneath his nails a dark line remained. It was not dirt. It was something that did not dissolve. A man in an old military jacket entered the diner near noon. They looked at each other briefly. There was no recognition, only a shared fatigue that required no language. The man ordered the cheapest whiskey. Lucas poured it without comment. They stood on opposite sides of the counter like men who had deserted the same army, though neither would have known how to name it. By evening, the rain had begun to mix with snow. Lucas stepped behind the diner to smoke. The drops struck the metal roof and fell onto the hood of an abandoned car with a steady, metallic sound. For a moment, the noise resembled something else, something harder, but he let the thought pass. Now it was only rain, only weather obeying its own laws. He tasted salt on his lips, perhaps from the road, perhaps from memory. Back in his room at the motel, he wiped his shoes with an old rag until they shone faintly in the weak light. On the linoleum floor, a dark stain spread where the melted snow had pooled. He lay down without unbracing and looked at his hands. They were red from detergent, rough at the knuckles. These were hands for this place. The scar along his finger belonged elsewhere. Before sleep took him, Snow began again, soft and clean. It covered the steps outside his door in white. For a few hours at least, nothing left a mark. The alarm on his phone vibrated before dawn, a thin mechanical tremor against the nightstand. Lucas did not need it. He had been awake for some time, listening to the pipes inside the wall knock like distant footsteps. The snow outside had stopped. Through the thin curtains, the world looked washed in a pale, indifferent light. He sat up slowly, as if the air itself resisted him, and pressed his feet into the cold shoes waiting by the bed. The steps outside the motel were covered in clean white again. For a moment he hesitated. The surface was untouched, almost careful. Then he walked forward. The first print broke the smoothness with a dull, gray wound. He did not look back, but he felt the pattern forming behind him, evidence of movement, proof that something heavy had passed through. At Joe's, the neon sign hummed without conviction. Inside, the smell of burned grease had settled into the walls like a second skin. Lucas tied his apron and began stacking cups. The waitress, a woman with hair the color of old straw, nodded at him but did not ask questions. They had reached the stage where silence was more practical than curiosity. Mid-morning brought a bus that did not usually stop. Its brakes exhaled sharply, and for a second, the town seemed to inhale with it. Two passengers stepped down, looked around, and then climbed back inside after a short exchange with the driver. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. Lucas watched from the window as the snow absorbed the tire tracks slowly, without protest. In the kitchen, the water ran again. He let his hands remain under it longer than necessary, feeling the heat bite at his skin. For an instant, he imagined the current strong enough to strip everything away: names, places, the accent no one noticed anymore. But when he shut the tap off, the scar on his finger was still there, pale and exact. That evening, as he crossed the lot back to the motel, the blinking C failed completely and stayed dark. The sign now read blue tar. Lucas paused under it. The missing letter changed nothing essential, yet the name felt lighter, less certain. He stood a while in the damp air, then went inside. The town remained where it was, patient and unmoved, as if waiting for him to understand something it had no intention of explaining. The third morning came without announcement. No new snow, only a thin crust of ice over what had already been dirt. Lucas stepped outside and found his old footprints frozen in place, hardened into shallow molds. They no longer looked like steps. They looked like damage. At Joe's, the coffee machine sputtered before it agreed to work. The first customers were two factory men who no longer had a factory. They spoke about repairs that would never be made and wages that would never return. Lucas refilled their cups without listening. Their voices blended with the hum of the refrigerator and the low buzz of the fluorescent lights. Sound without direction. Late morning, the man in the military jacket returned. He sat at the counter, but did not order whiskey this time. Coffee, he said, as if the word required effort. Up close, his jacket smelled of old rain and cold storage. There was a patch sewn over another patch, layers covering layers. Lucas placed the cup in front of him and noticed how the man's hands trembled, not violently, just enough to make the spoon click against porcelain. They did not speak of where they had been. Instead, the man asked about the price of gasoline, about the road conditions north of town, practical questions. Lucas answered quietly. In the reflection of the steel counter, their faces appeared side by side, distorted by scratches. Two men adjusted to smaller lives. That afternoon, the pipes in the kitchen backed up. Greasy water rose in the sink, slow and stubborn. Lucas rolled up his sleeves and reached into the cloudy mixture without hesitation. He pulled out a clotted mass of food and paper. The water drained reluctantly, leaving a brown ring along the metal basin. He scrubbed it clean, but the outline remained faintly visible, a memory of blockage. When he returned to the motel, the sign still read blue tar. The missing letter had not been repaired. In his room, he counted the cash from his apron pocket and placed it neatly on the dresser. It was enough for rent, not enough for departure. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling stain shaped like a continent. For a moment, he tried to remember its name. He could not decide which side he was supposed to be on. The fourth day began with rain instead of snow. It fell steadily, without drama, turning the thin crust of ice into a gray paste that clung to tires and cuffs. Lucas stood under the motel's overhang and watched the drops carve small channels through yesterday's footprints. The shapes dissolved quietly. There was no ceremony in their disappearance. At Joe's, the morning crowd was thinner. The waitress counted tips from the night shift and slid coins into a jar with careful precision. Lucas wiped the counter in slow circles, leaving damp trails that faded almost immediately. The man in the military jacket did not appear. In his place sat a young couple sharing a plate of eggs, speaking in low, urgent tones about leaving for Columbus. Their words had direction. Lucas listened without meaning to. Near noon, a delivery truck brought crates of canned soup. Lucas carried them to the storage room one by one. The cardboard softened under his fingers from the humidity. He stacked the cans methodically, labels facing outward. Rows of identical promises. Chicken, tomato, beef, warmth in theory. He ran his thumb along the metal rims and felt the faint edge where the lid had been sealed. Everything here was closed tight. In the afternoon, the rain intensified. Water slid down the diner's front window in crooked lines, bending the view of the highway. Cars passed as blurred silhouettes. Lucas paused with the plate in his hands and watched the distortion. The world outside looked almost fluid, as if it might rearrange itself into something simpler if the rain persisted long enough. That evening, back at the motel, the administrator handed him a thin envelope. No return address. Inside was a form letter from an agency he had once contacted months ago. Your request is still under review. The paper was dry and official. Lucas folded it once and placed it on the small desk without reading it again. Review meant suspension. Suspension meant wait without motion. He opened the window despite the damp air and let the sound of rain enter the room. It tapped against the metal railing, a restrained rhythm. He lay down fully dressed and listened. The past did not knock. It did not call. It only settled like water finding the lowest point. On the fifth morning, the rain stopped but left everything swollen. The parking lot behind the motel held shallow pools that reflected the broken letters of the sign. Blue tar floated upside down in dirty water. Lucas stepped around the puddles carefully, though he knew it made no difference. The hems of his pants were already dark. At Joe's, the coffee tasted thinner than usual. The waitress blamed the machine. Lucas said nothing and replaced the filter without being asked. The young couple from the day before did not return. In their booth sat an elderly man with a newspaper folded to the classifieds. He traced the columns with a finger, as if searching for a word he had misplaced. The paper left faint gray smudges on his skin. Midday brought a brief brightness. The clouds thinned and a weak sun exposed the town without improving it. The closed factory at the end of the street looked more precise in the light fences straight, windows intact, silence complete. Lucas carried trash to the dumpster and paused to look at the building. He tried to imagine it running, machines turning, belts moving. The image would not hold. The structure resisted memory. In the kitchen, a glass slipped from his hand and shattered in the sink. The sound was sharp but contained. He stared at the fragments for a moment before turning off the water. One piece had cut his thumb. Blood rose slowly, almost thoughtfully, mixing with soap and running pale down the drain. He wrapped the finger in a strip of paper towel and continued washing dishes with the other hand. When his shift ended, he walked past the highway instead of toward the motel. Cars moved steadily, indifferent to the town that held them for a few seconds before release. He stood at the edge of the shoulder and felt the wind from passing trucks press against his coat, movement without attachment. After a while, he turned back. In his room, he unwrapped the paper towel. The cut was shallow. It would close by itself. He sat on the bed and pressed his thumb against the old scar on his finger, comparing the two marks. One new, one permanent. Outside, the puddles began to dry, leaving behind irregular stains on the asphalt. Shapes without explanation. The sixth morning arrived with a low wind that moved along the street, like something searching for an opening. The puddles in the motel lot had thinned into dull stains. Lucas stepped over one and saw his reflection fracture across the uneven surface. For a second, his face seemed divided into separate pieces that did not belong together. At Joe's, the heater rattled but gave little warmth. The waitress had placed a small electric fan near her feet. Lucas began his shift without removing his coat. The elderly man with the classifieds returned and sat in the same booth. He did not order food, only coffee. His finger traced the same column as yesterday, as if the jobs might rearrange themselves overnight. Late morning, the man in the military jacket came back. He stood at the counter longer before sitting down. "Roads clear north," he said, though no one had asked. Lucas poured him coffee this time without waiting for an order. They spoke about nothing that mattered, about gas prices, about the wind cutting through the valley. The man's hands were steadier today. His eyes were not. In the kitchen, the hot water ran out. Only cold flowed from the tap, biting into Lucas's cut thumb. He worked through it, the plates slipping slightly under his fingers. The shock of the cold felt clean, almost honest. Steam no longer hid the walls. The room appeared smaller without it. During his break, Lucas stepped outside. The wind carried the smell of metal from the closed factory, a dry, forgotten scent. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke flatten and disappear immediately. No upward drift, just dispersal. He thought of the envelope on his desk, still unopened since the first reading, and felt no urgency to move it. That night, in his room, the pipes in the wall groaned again. He lay on his back and listened to the building settle into itself. The cut on his thumb had begun to close. The older scar remained unchanged. He held his hands up to the dim light and watched them tremble slightly from the cold. Outside, the wind pressed against the motel walls without entering. On the seventh day, the sky lowered itself until it seemed to rest on the roof of the diner. The air was heavier, damp without rain. Lucas walked to work with his hands in his pockets, feeling the small coins left from yesterday press against his palm. The factory at the end of the street looked closer than usual, as if the distance had shortened overnight. Joe's was nearly empty. The elderly man with the classifieds did not appear. The booth where he usually sat remained clean, the surface wiped too thoroughly. Lucas brewed a fresh pot of coffee and watched it drip in slow, patient intervals. Each drop landed with a soft, hollow sound, filling the glass pot with something dark and temporary. Near noon, a state trooper stopped by. His uniform was neat, his boots polished. He asked for pie and black coffee. Lucas served him without meeting his eyes for long. The trooper spoke about road checks north of town, about papers and permits. His tone was casual, almost friendly. Lucas nodded at the right moments. The words moved around him like wind around a post. In the kitchen, the cold water continued to run without heat. Lucas scrubbed pans harder than necessary. The metal rang against the sink, a dull percussion that filled the small space. For a brief second, he imagined leaving the tap open and walking out, letting the water flood the floor. The image faded before it formed completely. After his shift, he did not return directly to the motel. He walked to the edge of the factory fence and stood there, looking through the chain links at the silent yard. The machines inside were visible through the high windows shapes under dust. He pressed his fingers against the cold metal fence. It left a faint grid on his skin. Back in his room, he finally opened the envelope again and read the sentence once more. "Your request is still under review." He folded the paper carefully and placed it beneath the thin mattress, as if hiding it could reduce its weight. Outside, the wind moved across the parking lot, pushing loose gravel in small, restless circles. The motel sign flickered once and held. The eighth morning broke with a thin strip of pale light along the horizon. The clouds had pulled back slightly, not enough to clear the sky, only enough to reveal its colorless depth. Lucas stood at the motel door longer than usual. The air felt suspended, as if the town had paused between breaths. On his way to Joe's, he noticed fresh tire tracks leading out of the lot. The military jacket was gone. No farewell, no evidence beyond the faint lines curving toward the highway. Lucas looked at them for a moment, then continued walking. Departure, here, left little sound. Inside the diner, the state trooper returned. He placed a folded paper on the counter beside his plate. "Routine," he said. Lucas wiped his hands on his apron and unfolded it. A request for identification, proof of residence, dates. The trooper's eyes were steady, but not unkind. Lucas felt the old accent stir in his throat when he answered. The trooper wrote something down and finished his coffee without comment. In the kitchen, Lucas held the paper under the dim light. The letters were clear, official. He ran his thumb over the edge, where the form had been torn from a pad. The cut on his skin brushed the paper lightly. It did not bleed. He folded the form once and slipped it into his pocket. That evening, the sky finally cleared. The closed factory stood sharp against the fading light, its windows reflecting the last color of the day. Lucas walked past it without stopping. At the highway, cars moved steadily west. He watched them longer than he intended, feeling the wind from their passing push at his coat. Back at the motel, he removed the letter from his pocket and placed it beside the other one under the mattress. 2 sheets of paper, thin but persistent. He lay down and stared at the ceiling. The town was quiet in a way that did not promise safety, only continuation. Somewhere in the distance, a truck shifted gears and moved on. On the 9th morning, the air was clear and colder than before. The sky held a pale blue that felt temporary, like paint not yet dry. Lucas stepped outside and noticed how sharply the factory roof cut into the light. The town looked almost deliberate in its stillness. At Joe's, the waitress was counting inventory with a pencil pressed behind her ear. "Inspection next week," she said without looking at him. Lucas nodded. The words settled in the room like dust. He began polishing the metal counter, moving the cloth slowly across its scratched surface until his own reflection appeared faint and warped. The state trooper did not return. Instead, a man in a gray suit stopped by around noon. He carried a small briefcase and ordered tea. No pie, no coffee. His voice was flat, his questions precise about how long Lucas had been in town, about the address of the motel, about employment records. Lucas answered carefully, each sentence shorter than the last. The man wrote in a small notebook and left the tea unfinished. In the kitchen, the hot water returned without warning. Steam rose thick and immediate. Lucas stood still for a moment, letting the heat cover his hands. The plates moved faster through the sink. For the first time in days, the metal felt warm instead of distant. After work, he walked straight back to the motel. The administrator handed him a small parcel no return address again. Inside was his passport. No note, no explanation. The cover looked worn but intact. He held it in both hands, feeling its thin weight. In his room, he placed the passport on the desk and opened it slowly. The photograph stared back at him from another year, another version of his face. He closed it and set it beside the letters under the mattress. Outside, the evening light thinned into gray. The town remained unchanged, but something in his chest shifted slightly, like a door tested but not yet opened. The 10th day began without wind. The air lay flat against the buildings, and even the motel sign seemed to blink more quietly. Lucas stood at the sink in his room and washed his face in cold water. He watched it drip from his chin into the cracked porcelain basin. The passport remained on the desk where he had left it, closed, patient. At Joe's, the morning was busy for the first time in weeks. 2 trucks had broken down on the highway during the night, and their drivers filled the booths with heavy coats and low voices. Lucas moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Coffee, eggs, refills. His hands did not tremble. The rhythm of work felt almost sufficient. Near noon, the gray-suited man returned. He did not sit. He stood near the door and spoke briefly with the waitress, then with Lucas. "There may be delays," he said. "Documentation takes time." His tone suggested neither promise nor threat. Lucas nodded. He no longer asked what kind of delay. The man left as quietly as he had entered. In the kitchen, the steam thickened the air again. Lucas placed his palms flat against the metal counter and felt its warmth. For a moment, he imagined remaining here indefinitely, washing plates, counting tips, sleeping under the flicker of the broken sign. The image did not frighten him. It simply lacked movement. After his shift, he walked to the factory once more. The gate was chained, the padlock rusted but solid. He reached through the fence and touched the cold metal of a machine just inside. It was smooth, indifferent to his hand. He withdrew it slowly. That night, back in the motel room, he opened the passport again. He turned to the blank pages and ran his finger along their edges. There was space left. He did not pack his bag. He did not tear the letters in half. He lay down fully dressed and left the passport on his chest. Before sleep came, he listened to the quiet. It was not peace, it was suspension. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling like a moving horizon. Then the light was gone, and the room returned to its steady gray. The 11th morning carried a thin frost that returned without warning. The puddles in the lot hardened again, sealing yesterday's stains beneath a fragile surface. Lucas stood for a moment outside his door, passport in his coat pocket, feeling the cold settle through the fabric. The air did not move. It waited. At Joe's, the inspection had begun earlier than expected. 2 officials moved through the diner with clipboards, opening refrigerators, checking thermometers, lifting lids. Their movements were quiet, but systematic. Lucas washed dishes with measured precision. The hot water held steady. The steam rose and obscured the officials' faces until they stepped closer. One of them asked for his name. He gave it slowly. The accent slipped through on certain syllables, not strong enough to draw attention, only enough to remind him it was still there. The official wrote it down without comment, ink on paper. A small, contained acknowledgement of existence. Around noon, the waitress dropped a stack of plates. The crash cut through the room sharply. Everyone looked up. No one spoke. Lucas stepped forward and began collecting the fragments, placing them carefully into a cardboard box. The floor was wiped clean within minutes. The table was reset. Conversation resumed, as if interruption were a minor mechanical fault. When the officials left, they nodded once. "Acceptable," one of them said. The word lingered in the doorway after they were gone. Acceptable meant continuation, not approval, not belonging, just the absence of immediate closure. After his shift, Lucas walked past the motel and continued toward the highway. He stood at the shoulder with his hands in his pockets and felt the weight of the passport against his ribs. Cars moved east and west in steady lines. He imagined stepping forward, raising his thumb, choosing a direction. The thought was clear but distant. He returned to his room before dark. The frost had begun to soften again. Inside, he placed the passport on the desk and sat beside it. The town outside remained fixed in its position, factory silent, sign flickering, road persistent. Lucas rested his hands on his knees and waited, as if waiting itself were a decision. The 12th morning came with a low sun that revealed more than it improved. The frost had melted into a thin film over the asphalt, and the parking lot smelled faintly of damp metal. Lucas stood by the window before leaving his room. The passport lay open on the desk, its blank pages pale and unused. He closed it and slipped it into his coat without looking at the photograph again. At Joe's, the air felt lighter after the inspection. The waitress hummed softly while wiping tables. The coffee machine worked without complaint. Lucas moved through his tasks with a quiet steadiness. The repetition no longer pressed against him. It simply existed. Near midday, the elderly man with the classifieds returned. He folded the newspaper carefully and looked at Lucas for a moment longer than usual. "They're hiring in Dayton," he said, tapping the page. His voice carried no enthusiasm, only information. Lucas nodded. Dayton was a direction. It was also a name on paper. In the kitchen, the hot water ran clear and constant. Lucas washed the plates and watched the steam rise in slow waves. His cut had fully closed. The older scar remained unchanged, pale and fixed. He dried his hands and stood still for a moment, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. It sounded like breath drawn but not released. After his shift, he walked back to the motel without detouring toward the factory or the highway. The sign still read blue tar. The missing letter had become normal. In his room, he placed the passport on the bed and opened the small drawer where he kept his tips. He counted the bills carefully, smoothing each one flat. He did not pack everything. Only the essentials fit into his worn bag: 2 shirts, a razor, the folded letters, the passport. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. The walls held no memory of him. That felt accurate. Outside, the sky turned gray again. Not stormy, just undecided. Lucas zipped the bag and placed it by the door. He did not leave yet. He sat in the quiet, feeling the weight shift from his chest to the floor beside him. The town waited, as it always had. The 13th morning did not look different from the others. The sky remained low and colorless. Lucas stood beside the packed bag for a long time before touching it. The room felt slightly smaller with the drawer left open, the bed stripped of its usual disorder. He lifted the bag and tested its weight. It was manageable. At Joe's, he arrived earlier than usual. The waitress looked at the bag and said nothing. She poured him coffee without asking and left it at the end of the counter. Lucas drank it slowly. The taste had not improved, but it no longer surprised him. Around them, the diner prepared itself for another day. Chairs lowered, lights switched on, the door unlocked. The elderly man with the classifieds did not come. Neither did the gray-suited official or the state trooper. The morning passed in quiet routine. Plates, cups, steam. Lucas moved through each task carefully, as if memorizing the weight of every object. The sink, the faucet, the narrow shelf where the soap bottle leaned near noon. He untied his apron and folded it once. He placed it on the counter and counted his final tips. The waitress watched him, her expression neutral. "Roads clear," she said, the same words the man in the military jacket had once used. Lucas nodded. There was nothing to add. Outside, the factory stood unchanged, the chain on the gate unmoved. Lucas walked past it without stopping. At the edge of town, the highway opened in 2 directions. He paused at the shoulder, the wind pressing lightly against his coat. Trucks passed with steady indifference. He set the bag down and looked at his hands. The newer cut had faded into a thin line. The older scar remained. He picked up the bag again and stepped forward, not onto the road, not yet, but closer to its edge. The movement was small, almost imperceptible. Behind him, the town held its position motel sign, flickering, diner humming, factory silent. In front of him, The asphalt stretched without explanation. Lucas stood between them, the weight in his hand and the weight in his chest balanced for the first time. The 14th morning arrived without color. A fine mist hung over the highway, softening the edges of everything it touched. Lucas stood at the shoulder where he had stopped the day before. The bag felt lighter in his hand, though nothing had been removed from it. The town behind him was quiet, reduced to outlines. A truck approached from the east, its engine low and steady. Lucas raised his hand, not high, not urgently, just enough to be seen. The truck passed him at first, then its brake lights flared red through the mist. It slowed and rolled to a stop several meters ahead. He walked toward it without hurry. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and opened the door. No questions. Just a brief glance that measured the bag and the face that carried it. Lucas climbed in and closed the door carefully, as if entering a room where someone was already asleep. The cab smelled of diesel and stale coffee. The windshield framed the road in a narrow strip of gray. As the truck pulled back onto the highway, the town receded without resistance. The factory roof dissolved into mist. The motel sign, broken letter and all, vanished behind a curve. Lucas rested the bag between his boots. He did not speak. The driver adjusted the radio, then left it off. The road moved beneath them in long, continuous lines. Lucas looked straight ahead. The weight had not disappeared. It had shifted, redistributed across distance and speed. Behind them, the small town resumed its position as if nothing had changed. Ahead, the highway offered no promises, only direction. Lucas placed his hand lightly on the passport inside his coat and kept it there. The mist thickened, then thinned again. The truck continued west. Ash on the railing. The heat arrived without wind. It simply sat down on the porch and stayed. The boards creaked under Ray's weight briefly, as if checking whether they still wished to hold him. In the kitchen, the refrigerator compressor hummed. Short bursts, short silences, the last pulse of civilization. The air was orange, not sunset, just air. A beer bottle stood on the railing. Glass wet with condensation, the coldest object in the entire state. Droplets slid down slowly, cutting clean paths through the dust. Beyond it, the horizon. A thin stripe of smoke, almost decorative, as if someone had drawn a line of charcoal between the trees and the sky. It was already carrying ash. Thomas held the knife the way he once held an axe or a hose, firmly, without haste. He tilted the bottle, slid the blade beneath the cap. A brief metallic snap. The cap flew into the corner of the porch and came to rest beside a stain of rust. It was a ritual. Open, drink, ask nothing. The knife belonged to a time when there had still been something left to save. Miguel stared at his phone. The screen was blank, no signal. He lifted it higher, as if the air might return something. Nothing returned. He set the phone down beside the bottle and did not touch it again. The men sat close, their elbows almost touching. The silence was heavy, but familiar. Not awkward, shared. Ray looked at his hands. They no longer cut wood. The skin thick, cracked. Dark lines beneath the nails. They still smelled of resin. The compressor fell silent. For a moment, the house seemed empty. The air did not move, not a leaf, not dust. An ash flake settled on the neck of the bottle and clung to the moisture. No one brushed it away. No one spoke about the fire, though all of them could already taste it in their mouths. The smoke was no longer a line on the horizon. It had weight now. It settled in the throat. It stayed there. Sweat ran down Ray's neck and disappeared beneath his collar. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his shirt. The fabric was yellowed, rough against the skin. He did not look at what he was doing. The motion was automatic, slow, practiced. The sleeve left a darker streak along the collar. He lowered his arm and stared ahead. Thomas reached for the small radio on the windowsill. He turned the knob. Static. A thin, cracking voice pushed through. Words broke apart and returned. Roads closed. Evacuation recommended. County lines. The signal faded, then sharpened again. None of them asked which roads. Thomas set the radio down. It kept whispering to itself. Ash began to settle on the railing. Fine. Almost soft. It gathered in the cracks of the wood, along the rim of the beer bottles. Thomas brushed it away with his palm. A gray smear remained on his skin. He looked at it for a moment, then wiped his hand against his jeans. Within a minute, the ash returned. Thinner, wider. The railing was turning pale. Ray lifted his bottle. The glass was no longer cold. The condensation had thinned to a faint dampness. He took a drink. The first swallow was lukewarm. Flat, not pleasure. Just liquid to rinse dust from the mouth. He swallowed again anyway. Miguel opened another bottle. The snap of the cap rang sharp in the still air. It sounded like a shot. Ray watched him. Said nothing. Hot, Miguel muttered. Ray nodded. Yeah, Thomas coughed. A dry, measured sound. His only clock. The radio crackled again. More static than voice. The air did not move. Ash drifted down and settled on the necks of the bottles, on the sleeves of their shirts, on the rough boards beneath their boots. They drank. No one spoke about leaving. The smoke reached the porch. It did not hurry. It slid between the boards, rested against the railing, entered the lungs without asking. Thomas coughed. A short, dry tear in the silence. His throat twitched. He turned his head as if that might make it smaller. He lifted the bottle and drank too quickly. The swallow caught halfway down. He pressed his lips tight and nodded once, as though he had managed something. The cough returned, softer, deeper. The forest was no longer outside him. No one looked at him for long. Ray pulled a crumpled pack from his shirt pocket. The cardboard was soft from sweat. He tapped it against his palm and held it out. Miguel shook his head. No, Ray did not insist. He placed a cigarette between his lips, struck a match against the railing. The flame rose thin and pale. It wavered in the heavy air. Against the red sun, it looked unnecessary. He cupped it anyway, drew in, and the tip glowed dull orange. The match burned down to his fingers. He dropped it and crushed it beneath his boot. They watched the horizon. It was no longer simply orange. The color thickened, darkened. A dirty purple crept in from the edges, swallowing the line of trees. The sun hung low, swollen, as if unsure where to go next. Thomas coughed again. A dry scraping sound. He covered it with his fist. Then with another swallow. Time did not move forward. It circled the porch. The same boards. The same bottles. The same breath. Ray exhaled slowly. Smoke left his mouth and mixed with the air. For a moment, it was impossible to tell what came from him and what came from the hills. A gray flake settled on his lower lip. He wiped it away with his thumb and did not look at it. Ash fell onto the glowing end of his cigarette. Some of it belonged there. Some of it did not. He watched it gather and could not tell which was tobacco and which was Oregon. He drew in again. The horizon darkened by a shade. No one said anything. The smoke thickened. It lay low across the porch and pressed against their chests. Miguel turned the empty cap between his fingers. He did not look up when he spoke. Last year the smoke was smaller. It was not a complaint, just a hand reaching backward. Ray took a slow drink. The beer was warm now. He swallowed and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Maybe it only seemed smaller. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words settled heavily between them. Miguel nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. Thomas stared into his empty bottle. He tilted it, watching the last drop slide along the glass and disappear. The forest always grows back, he said. He spoke to the bottle, not to the men. His thumb traced the rim. His shoulders lifted in a shallow breath and fell again. No one argued. The silence that followed was thicker than the smoke. It filled the spaces between their boots, between their elbows. The radio crackled faintly inside the house and then went quiet. Ray looked toward the hills. He thought of his son in Arizona. Dry land, flat light. The boy had left early, packed his truck and driven south. Ray had called it impatience back then. Now he was not sure. The kid had known when to move. That was all. Ray stayed seated. The air scratched at his throat. He coughed once, softly, and forced it down. Miguel picked at a splinter in the railing. Thomas turned the bottle in his hand, as if there might still be something left inside. The forest always grows back, Thomas repeated, quieter. A crooked smile touched Miguel's mouth and vanished. Ray exhaled slowly. The smoke did not thin. They sat and listened to nothing. The hills were still there. The fire was not visible, but the heat had begun to press against their skin, as if it were already close. The wind shifted, not cool, not relief. A hard breath of hot air rolled up the hill and struck the porch. The smoke followed it. What had been a distant veil became a wall. It pushed through the railing, across their boots, into their faces. The air thickened until it felt solid. Ray narrowed his eyes. The horizon disappeared behind gray. The sun turned red. Not orange, not gold. A flat, blood-colored disk pressed against the sky. The light changed with it. Everything looked older, as if seen through a sheet of stained glass. Their faces lost their edges. Skin turned unfamiliar. The boards beneath them glowed dull and strange, like a photograph left too long in a drawer. Thomas watched the cigarette burn between his fingers. The ember trembled in the wind. He crushed it out against the sole of his boot before it was finished. He did it quickly, almost impatiently. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the crushed tip and was swallowed at once. Ray lifted the last bottle. The beer inside was warm as bathwater. He drank it in one slow pull, set the empty down beside the others. The bottles stood in a line along the railing. Brown glass catching the red light, silent, identical. They looked like witnesses who had nothing to add. Miguel checked his phone again. He wiped ash from the screen with his thumb. The display glowed faintly. No bars, no symbol, nothing. Just empty glass and plastic reflecting the red sky. In his hand it seemed light, useless. He held it a moment longer, then let his arm drop. The wind rose again. Ash spiraled in small circles across the porch boards. It gathered in the corners, in the creases of their shirts, in the folds of their palms. No one spoke. The silence rang in their ears. Then, far off, a sharp crack from the trees. Another. Wood splitting under heat. The sound traveled slowly, like something testing the distance. The red light deepened. The smoke pressed closer. They remained seated. After the sale, the evening air hung low and damp, pressing against the black-painted walls of the house that had once been white. A neon sign flickered above the door, its red light bleeding onto the parking lot where cheap pickups idled and cigarette smoke drifted without purpose. Tomas sat in his truck with the engine off. The metal still clicked as it cooled, small sounds like restrained arguments. He watched the entrance. That door had once opened onto a narrow hallway lined with family photographs. He remembered the order of the frames, not the faces inside them. Inside, the music was too loud for conversation and too empty for dancing. The bar counter stood where the living room had been. He could see it without looking, mapping it in his head, the corner where the sofa sagged, the window that let in the hard afternoon sun. The floor lights flashed across boards that were still slightly uneven. He knew where the edge of the old carpet had curled. A bartender wiped glasses with mechanical patience. Lena stood by the register, checking numbers on the screen. Tomas ordered coffee. No one else did. It cooled quickly in his hands, as if the room rejected it. He kept glancing at the staircase. It was the same wood, though the railing had been painted a glossy black. The paint could not hide the slight dip in the third step. He had fallen there once, running too fast, chased by nothing more serious than his brother's laughter. Now bass vibrations traveled up through it, shaking loose small memories that had nowhere to settle. The restroom door stood where his bedroom had been. White tiles covered the walls that once held a baseball poster, edges taped down to hide peeling paint. He placed his palm against the cold surface, not to prove anything, only to confirm that the wall still existed. For a moment, he understood that he had not lost the house tonight. It had been sold long before the speakers and neon arrived on the afternoon his father signed papers at a bank desk and did not look back. When Lena asked if it was his first time there, he answered, yes. The lie required no effort. Outside, rain began tapping against the metal awning above the entrance, the same hollow rhythm he remembered from childhood storms. Only now it was interrupted by the dull pulse of music behind him. He did not go back inside. He did not ask to see upstairs. He returned to his truck and sat in the dim cabin light while rain gathered on the windshield. The neon sign flickered again as he started the engine. In the rear-view mirror, the house appeared smaller, almost temporary. He waited a minute before pulling onto the highway. The radio stayed off. There was only the steady hiss of rain on the roof of the cab. Headlights from passing cars filled the interior with brief white light, then vanished. The darkness returned each time, patient and complete. The highway carried him west, away from the town's single blinking intersection and the hollow shell of the paper mill. Tomas drove with the steadiness of a man who no longer measured distance in miles, but in the dull fatigue behind his eyes. The rain thinned, then stopped. Water streaked across the windshield like erased lines. In the side mirror, the town dissolved into scattered lights and then into nothing. He did not turn on the radio. The cab held its own sounds, the low vibration of the engine, the faint rattle from a loose thermos cap, the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. He remembered the layout of the house again, not out of longing, but habit. The kitchen table had stood beneath a narrow lamp with a yellow shade. His mother's chair faced the window. His father's back had always been to the wall. He could place them in space as precisely as cargo straps in a trailer. Faces blurred. Angles remained exact. At a rest stop 2 hours later, he parked beneath a pale sodium light. The vending machines hummed behind thick glass. He bought another coffee, though he did not want it. The cup warmed his hands without conviction. A young couple stood near the ice machine, laughing too loudly at something private. Tomas watched them without judgment. They leaned into each other as if the world had not yet begun to subtract from them. Back on the road, the night opened wider. Trucks passed in disciplined lines, each driver sealed inside his own illuminated rectangle. Tomas felt the familiar comfort of movement, the only room that had not been sold. In motion, nothing could be rearranged by strangers. Asphalt did not remember who had walked on it. It only accepted weight and released it. Somewhere past the state line, he understood that returning had not been an attempt to reclaim anything. It had been a measurement. The house was smaller, the staircase narrower. Even the silence had shrunk. The sale had happened long ago, and not only on paper. It had begun the first time he packed a bag and left for work, telling himself it was temporary. The headlights ahead stretched into a thin silver thread. He followed it without hurry. The night did not promise comfort or revelation. It offered only distance. And for now, distance was enough. By dawn, the sky had thinned into a pale, indifferent gray. Tomas pulled into a truck stop that smelled of diesel and old grease. The fluorescent lights inside hummed with a tired persistence. He sat in the booth farthest from the window, where the vinyl seat was cracked and cold. The waitress poured coffee without asking. He nodded once. Outside, engines idled like restless animals waiting to be released. He unfolded a paper map, though he no longer needed one. The routes were etched into him. Still, he traced the thin red lines with a blunt finger, as if confirming that the country had not shifted overnight. His hometown was a small dot. He did not look it directly. He measured instead the distance to the next delivery, the time it would take, the hours left before mandatory rest. Practical numbers, clean. They did not carry the weight of memory. Across the aisle, an older driver spoke loudly about freight rates and broken transmissions. The words floated over the clatter of plates. Tomas listened without engaging. He knew that tone, the need to fill space with complaint, so silence would not expose anything softer beneath it. He stirred his coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. When he stepped back outside, the air was colder. Morning revealed everything without mercy. The faded paint on trailers, the oil stains spreading across concrete, the tired faces behind windshields. He climbed into his cab and paused before closing the door. For a moment, he imagined the house again, not as it had been, but as it stood now, dark walls, pulsing lights, strangers leaning against what used to be his childhood. He did not feel anger, not even regret, only a mild astonishment that something so solid could become unrecognizable and still continue functioning. The world did not pause for renovation. It repurposed. He started the engine. The vibration settled into his bones like a familiar ache. As he pulled back onto the highway, the sun pushed weakly through the clouds. It illuminated nothing in particular. The road stretched forward, wide and obedient. Tomas adjusted the mirrors and kept his eyes on the lane ahead. The past had been measured. The result was clear. There was no refund for what had been sold. Only freight to deliver and miles that did not ask questions. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared into a brittle blue that made everything appear sharper than it felt. Tomas backed the trailer into a loading dock behind a warehouse that had once been a textile plant. The brick facade carried a new logo in polished steel letters. He watched the dock worker guide him with indifferent gestures. Precision mattered. Meaning did not. Inside the office, he signed the digital pad without reading the fine print. The clerk, a young man with trimmed beard and restless eyes, spoke about efficiency and quarterly growth. Tomas nodded at the right moments. He recognized the tone. It was the same one Lina had used business first, memory irrelevant. Buildings changed owners. Words changed packaging. The structure beneath remained hollow. He walked around the trailer while they unloaded, boots scraping against gravel. The metallic clang of forklifts echoed against concrete walls. He found himself studying the warehouse windows' tall, narrow panes that might once have belonged to a school or church. He imagined children running through corridors that now held stacked pallets and shrink-wrapped inventory. The repurposing felt orderly, almost polite. In the cab again, he checked the delivery confirmation on his phone. The screen glowed with sterile approval. Transaction complete. He set the device face down on the dashboard. For a moment, he thought of his father's signature on those bank papers years ago. Another transaction. Another confirmation. The handwriting had been steady. That steadiness had unsettled him more than doubt would have. Evening approached without ceremony. The sun lowered behind flat industrial rooftops, staining the air with a brief orange that did not last. Tomas leaned back in the driver's seat, eyes half closed. He understood now that nothing had been taken from him abruptly. It had been converted, like factories into bars, like bedrooms into tiled restrooms. The transformation was gradual enough to seem reasonable. He started the engine again. The vibration filled the small cabin, firm and predictable. Ahead lay another stretch of interstate, lit by exit signs and corporate logos. Behind him, the warehouse doors rolled shut with mechanical finality. He did not look back. The sale had been processed. The receipt, if it existed, had long since faded. Night found him again somewhere between state lines. The sky flattened into a dark sheet without depth. The interstate lights cast pale circles on the asphalt, repeating at measured intervals. Tomas drove within them, as if moving from one small island of certainty to the next. The cargo behind him shifted slightly on a curve. He adjusted without thinking. He stopped once more near midnight at a fuel station open all night, its windows harsh with fluorescent light. Inside, the shelves carried the same tired arrangement plastic-wrapped sandwiches, dusted candy bars, thermoses lined like obedient soldiers. A television above the counter murmured headlines no one watched. Tomas paid in cash. The receipt curled in his hand before he dropped it into the trash. Back outside, he leaned against the truck and lit a cigarette. The smoke rose straight up. The wind had died. He tried to summon a clear image of the house, as it had been before paint and speakers. But what came instead was the sound of rain on the old metal gutter, steady and patient. He realized that even that memory belonged less to the walls than to the air around them. Air could not be sold. It only moved on. He understood now that the sale had not erased anything essential. It had only stripped away the illusion that place could hold what people would not. The staircase still existed. The third step still dipped, but the weight on it had changed. That was all. He flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. When he climbed back into the cab, the interior felt smaller, but sufficient. He started the engine and waited for the gauges to settle. In the side mirror, the station's lights trembled slightly in the heat rising from the asphalt. Then he pulled away, merging into the slow procession of trucks that moved like a quiet convoy through the dark. The highway accepted him without ceremony. No one asked where he had been. No one asked why he left. The road did not remember childhoods or signatures on bank papers. It only carried weight forward. Tomas kept his hands steady on the wheel. Ahead, red taillights marked a path that did not promise return. It promised continuation. For now, that was enough. A town beneath artificial mountains, neon rain leaned over the roadside diner and did not warm anything it touched. Across the narrow road lay the old cemetery, its stones washed in an electric blue that made the names look temporary. Above them, the billboard glowed with a polished SUV and the promise of a freedom no one here had ordered. Inside, Evelyn moved a gray rag across the counter in slow circles, as if time itself had spilled and could still be wiped away. Jacob sat at the corner table with his back to the window. His hands were permanently dark at the creases, oil that no soap had ever persuaded to leave. The coffee before him had gone cold long ago, yet he kept the cup between his palms. Outside, the billboard mechanism cracked softly every few minutes, shifting light from white to a colder shade. He tried to strike a match. It snapped. He tried another, then a third. The room accepted each small failure without comment. Logan entered with the smell of damp earth clinging to his coat. He removed his cap and nodded once. They spoke about the left lamp on the billboard, how it had burned out again. It was easier to discuss a bulb than what lay beneath its glow. Their words were thin, practical, sufficient. When the young couple came and went, leaving behind a trace of expensive perfume and a glossy magazine, Jacob rose without haste. He dropped the magazine into the trash, not in anger, simply to restore the room to what it understood. Rain began, heavy and unclean. Water gathered between the graves, and the shining SUV seemed to drive through the mud of forgotten names. Logan left to tend the fresh mounds. Jacob remained a moment longer, feeling the cold metal of an old keychain in his pocket. Grief had no edge anymore. It had become a habit, like morning coffee. Outside, under the humming sign, he lit his last cigarette. The smoke dissolved into rain. The word open flickered once and died. It was not a catastrophe. Only another night to endure until the color of the neon thinned into morning. Rain had not stopped by morning. It only thinned like a tired argument that no longer expected to win. The billboard still burned above the graves, pale and stubborn. The SUV now seemed suspended in mist, its bright chrome dulled by water that streaked the painted sky behind it. Freedom looked heavier in daylight. Jacob had not gone far. He stood by the fence until the cigarette finished itself between his fingers. When he finally turned, he did not look back at the stones. He walked along the shoulder of the road where puddles held broken pieces of blue light. Each passing truck sent a cold spray against his trousers. He did not step aside. Inside the diner, Evelyn counted the register with movements as careful as prayer. Coins clicked against each other with a small metallic certainty. She paused once, listening to the rain on the roof. For a moment, she imagined the cemetery without the billboard, only grass, stone, and sky. The thought did not last. She locked the drawer. Logan moved between the graves with a shovel balanced over his shoulder. The fresh mounds had begun to sag at the edges. Water carved shallow lines into them. He pressed the soil back into shape with the flat of his spade. The work was quiet and exact. The dead did not complain. When Jacob reached the old bus stop at the edge of town, he found it unchanged. The bench was damp. The timetable had faded into an illegible blur. No buses had stopped there in years, but the sign remained, as if hope required only a pole and a rectangle of tin. He sat down anyway. Across the fields, the billboard flickered once in the gray morning. A brief white flare erased the cemetery, the road, the diner. Then the light settled back into its artificial blue. Jacob watched the empty highway and waited, not for a bus, not for freedom, but for the simple permission to keep breathing until evening. By noon, the rain had withdrawn into a low ceiling of clouds. The road steamed faintly, as if the earth were exhaling something it no longer wanted. Trucks moved along the highway with the steady indifference of machinery that has never known hesitation. Jacob remained at the bus stop until the dampness reached his bones. Then he stood and walked back toward town, not because he expected anything there, but because there was nowhere else to go. The cemetery smelled of wet soil and iron. Logan was near the older section now, straightening a crooked stone with both hands. His jacket hung heavier than in the night, the tear at the shoulder darker for water. He did not look up when Jacob passed the fence. They exchanged no sign. Between them lay an understanding that did not require speech. The living maintain the ground. The ground keeps what it is given. Inside the diner, the neon was weaker in daylight, but it did not switch off. It hummed, persistent, like a thought that refuses to fade. Evelyn had opened the windows a crack. The air carried diesel from the road and the faint sweetness left behind by the young couple's perfume. She wiped the same strip of counter again. The rag left a dull shine that held for only a moment before the surface returned to its tired mat. Jacob took his old seat without asking. The coffee was fresh this time. Steam rose and disappeared halfway to the ceiling. He watched it thin and vanish. On the wall opposite him hung a small clock with a cracked face. The second hand moved in short, determined jumps. Each tick sounded larger than it should have in such a small room. Outside, a delivery truck slowed at the light that no one obeyed. For a brief second, its driver glanced at the billboard, then at the graves beneath it. The truck moved on. Nothing in the town shifted. The sign continued to promise distance. The cemetery continued to receive names. And in the space between them, the day unfolded without protest, patient and unremarkable. Toward evening, the sky lowered again, not with rain this time, but with a dull metallic light. The billboard brightened in response, as if it drew strength from the coming dark. The SUV gleamed harder, the smiling family untouched by weather or time. Beneath it, the cemetery settled into shadow. The stones lost their edges and became low shapes in the grass. Jacob finished his coffee and did not order another. He watched the door each time it opened, though he did not expect anyone. A salesman stopped in for 5 minutes, spoke loudly into his phone about contracts and miles, then left behind a crumpled receipt and the smell of impatience. The room absorbed him, as it absorbed everything else. Logan returned before dusk. Mud clung to the cuffs of his trousers. He sat without removing his cap this time. "They'll replace the lamp tomorrow," he said, meaning the burned-out section of the sign. Jacob nodded. Repairs came quickly for things that shone. The graves waited. Evelyn switched on the interior lights early. Their yellow glow was weak against the blue outside. For a moment, the two colors met on the window glass, blending into a green that did not belong to either of them. She paused, looking at that thin line where light divided itself. Then she turned away and reached for the coffee pot. When Jacob stepped outside again, the air had grown colder. The first star was hidden behind the billboard's glare. He stood by the fence, listening to the low electrical hum above him. It sounded almost like breath. For a second, he imagined the town without that sound, without the promise hanging over the dead. The silence that followed the thought was deeper than he expected. He placed his palm against the cold metal of the fence. On the other side lay the names he knew and the ones he did not. Above them, freedom continued to glow. Jacob did not curse it. He simply stood there until the blue light settled over his face and the night resumed its steady, indifferent watch. The next morning arrived without color. Fog lay low over the cemetery, pressing the stones into a single gray mass. The billboard hovered above it, like something detached from weather, its message still clear, still confident. The new lamp on the left side burned brighter than the rest. The repair had been made before dawn. Jacob noticed the difference at once. Light no longer flickered. It held steady, clean, and uninterrupted. He stood by the road a moment longer than usual, studying the flawless surface of the sign. It seemed younger than the town, younger than grief. He adjusted the collar of his shirt and crossed toward the diner. Inside, Evelyn had placed fresh sugar packets in a careful row. The radio murmured low news about markets and distant cities. None of it concerned this place. She glanced at Jacob only briefly. He took his seat and wrapped both hands around the warm cup she set before him. This time, he drank it while it was still hot. Logan did not come that morning. His absence settled into the room like an extra chair no one moved. Through the window, Jacob saw a small maintenance truck parked near the cemetery gate. Two men in clean jackets examined the base of the billboard, pointing upward. One of them laughed. The sound did not carry far. A thin wind rose by noon, lifting loose leaves and pressing them against the fence. Jacob stepped outside again, drawn by a restlessness he could not name. He walked along the graves until he reached the fresh mound that had sagged in the rain. The soil had hardened overnight. He pressed it once with the heel of his shoe, not to disturb it, only to feel its resistance. Above him, the repaired lamp hummed without fault. The SUV gleamed as if it were in motion. Jacob looked at it for a long time, then at the quiet ground beneath. For the first time, he sensed that the sign would outlast them all, not because it was stronger, but because it was replaceable. He turned back toward the diner, carrying that knowledge with the same steady weight as his oil-stained hands. The wind held through the afternoon and stripped the last leaves from the trees along the fence. They collected in the shallow dips between graves, thin and brittle. The billboard did not move. Its surface remained smooth, untouched by season. The repaired lamp glowed with a sterile patience. Jacob returned to the diner before dusk. The room felt narrower than before, as if the walls had shifted inward by an inch. Evelyn was stacking clean cups with deliberate care. The radio had fallen silent. Only the low hum of the neon sign outside pressed through the glass. "Logan?" Jacob asked. "Hospital," she said, without turning. Collapsed near the south row, the words did not carry drama. They settled like dust. Jacob nodded once and sat down. He did not remove his coat. The coffee tasted thinner that evening. He drank it anyway. After dark, he walked toward the cemetery alone. The gate stood half open. A shallow trench near the newer graves lay exposed where Logan had been working. The shovel rested against a stone, its handle damp. Jacob picked it up and pressed the loose soil back into place, flattening it with slow, even strokes. The work was heavier than he remembered. Above him, the billboard shimmered in the wind. For a moment, the image distorted, the smiling family bending at the edges. Then the surface steadied. Jacob drove the shovel into the ground once more and left it upright. When he stepped back to the road, the night had deepened. The neon washed his face blue again. He felt no anger at the sign, no grief sharp enough to name. Only a quiet understanding. Men collapse, lamps are replaced, soil is pressed flat. The light continues because someone pays for it. He stood there until the hum blended with the wind and became one sound. Then he turned toward the diner, where the door was still unlocked, and walked back into the dim room that smelled of coffee and time. Logan did not return the next day. The hospital lights burned on the hill beyond town, small and distant, like another kind of billboard. No one spoke of prognosis. In places like this, absence explained itself. Jacob arrived at the cemetery before the diner opened. The shovel still stood where he had left it, leaning slightly now. The soil had settled overnight. He pressed it again with the flat of the blade, not because it needed it, but because the gesture felt necessary. The wind had quieted. Only the low electric murmur from above filled the air. The billboard seemed brighter in the early gray. The SUV cut across painted mountains that had never known rust or frost. The family inside it smiled at a horizon that required no maintenance. Jacob watched the image until it blurred at the edges. For a moment, he imagined the sign empty, just a blank white rectangle over the graves. The thought did not stay. Inside the diner, Evelyn had placed a small handwritten note near the register. Closed early tonight. The ink had bled slightly into the paper. She poured Jacob's coffee without asking. Her movements were slower than usual, as if the air had thickened. "They'll send someone else," she said quietly, meaning the cemetery. Jacob nodded. There was always someone else. That was the structure of things. People were singular. Roles were not. By evening, the new caretaker had not yet arrived. The gate remained half open. Jacob walked back once more and closed it with both hands. The metal latch clicked into place with a plain, final sound. He stood there a moment, listening to the silence beneath the billboard's hum. When the neon flickered on against the dark, it cast its cold wash over the stones and over him. He did not look up this time. He looked at the ground in front of his boots and felt the firm resistance of earth beneath them. It was enough to stand on. For now, that was enough. The new caretaker arrived on a Monday. His truck was clean, the paint unscarred by weather. He wore gloves too bright for the soil and walked the rows with a clipboard held close to his chest. From the diner window, Jacob watched him pause beneath the billboard, studying the shadow it cast across the older stones. The man tilted his head as if measuring something that could not be written down. Inside, the air felt thinner. Evelyn had removed Logan's usual cup from the shelf. The empty space where it had stood was small but visible. She filled the silence by rearranging salt shakers, aligning them with the edge of the counter. Jacob noticed the precision. He noticed everything now. The caretaker entered near noon. He ordered water, not coffee. His voice was steady, unfamiliar. "Ground softer than I expected," he said to no one in particular. Jacob nodded. Soft ground required attention. Hard ground required strength. Neither asked for opinion. Later, a delivery truck stopped longer than usual by the billboard. Two men climbed a ladder and adjusted the lower edge of the frame. For a brief minute, the sign went dark. The cemetery lost its blue tint and returned to ordinary gray. The stones looked older without the electric wash, more settled into the earth. When the light came back, it was sharper. The SUV's chrome flashed. The caretaker stepped outside and squinted upward. Jacob remained seated, his hands wrapped around a cup that had already cooled. He understood then that the town did not change. It was only maintained. That evening, as the neon spread across the damp grass again, Jacob walked the short distance to the fence. He did not enter. He simply stood there, watching the caretaker's truck pull away down the road. The hum above him was constant, even almost soothing. It was not hope. It was continuity. And in its steady vibration, Jacob felt the quiet rhythm of something that would go on, with or without him. Autumn deepened without announcement. The grass between the graves thinned, turning the color of old paper. Frost appeared in the early hours and dissolved before noon, leaving the stones damp and pale. The billboard continued to glow with undiminished confidence. Its mountains remained green, its sky impossibly blue. Jacob began waking earlier. Sleep had become shallow, easily broken by the distant hum that carried even into his small rented room. He walked past the cemetery before sunrise, when the neon still held authority over the dark. The caretaker's truck was already there some mornings. Work began quietly now, without conversation. Inside the diner, fewer travelers stopped. Fuel prices had risen. Highways had other exits. Evelyn noticed the emptiness in the register before she noticed it in the chairs. She spoke less. When she wiped the counter, the cloth moved more slowly, as if conserving motion. One afternoon, a thin crack appeared along the lower corner of the billboard frame. Wind had found a weakness. The image trembled slightly when trucks passed at high speed. The smiling family flickered at the edges, almost imperceptibly. Jacob saw it first and said nothing. The caretaker reported it by phone, standing near the fence. "Minor damage," he said. "They'll send someone." Repairs were always promised. Repairs were part of the structure. That night, the wind returned stronger than before. It pressed against the sign with a steady force. The crack widened by a fraction. For a brief second, the entire image shuddered, and the neon cast uneven light across the graves. Jacob stood beneath it, collar raised, watching the instability spread like a fine line across glass. He did not hope for collapse. He did not fear it either. He only understood that even electric promises depend on bolts and brackets. And bolts, like men, eventually loosen. Intersection without promise. The town ended where the dust began. September lay over Wyoming like a borrowed coat, too thin for what was coming. The primary school stood with its windows broken out, hollow sockets facing the road. Behind it, rusted water towers caught the sinking sun and bled a dull orange into the air. Cooper sat on the curb as if waiting for a bus that had already passed. His jacket, once part of a suit, had faded into an unnamed collar. The elbows shone with wear. He struck a match and watched the flame travel down to his fingers before accepting the cigarette. He did not look poor. He looked finished. The street carried no sound except the faint scrape of his shoe against concrete. The day had already happened. What remained was its shadow stretching across the asphalt. From his pocket, he drew a piece of chalk, gray and chipped, stolen from a construction site. He bent and began to write directly on the road. The chalk protested against the rough surface. The equation formed slowly X and Y, searching for balance. A pickup passed without slowing. The driver did not turn his head. Cooper leaned in closer, his hand trembling but the lines steady. Beside him, coffee cooled in a paper cup. Dust gathered on its surface like a thin skin. A woman stopped a few steps away. Grace from the gas station. Her uniform carried the smell of diesel and cheap detergent. She did not speak at first. Her shadow fell across the symbols. "Counting zero again?" she asked. "Zero is the only honest number," he said, without lifting his eyes. She set down a fresh pack of the cheapest cigarettes and walked back toward the pumps. No thanks were exchanged. Cooper stared at the integral as if it might remember him. He saw a lecture hall, chalk dust floating in slanted light, young faces pretending to understand. They were elsewhere now selling insurance, fighting other men's wars. Numbers had not betrayed him. They had simply remained themselves. A small ant crossed one of his lines, hesitated, and wandered off the curve. He watched it without pity. The line led nowhere. That was not tragedy. It was structure. Wind rose from the open lots and carried newspapers and grit. The chalk began to blur, the symbols dissolving into the road. Cooper did not shield them. Loss had become a small, repetitive motion, like breathing. He felt the cold slip under his shirt. Winter would arrive without asking permission. Lights in the houses along the street went out one by one. He stood and walked to the boarded doors of the school. On a loose plank, he drew one last mark, not a variable, not a solution. Just a single stroke. It meant the work was done. By morning, the wind or rain would erase it. He accepted that. Far off, the highway hummed. 2 yellow headlights appeared in the dark plain. Cooper did not decide anything. He turned once toward the school, lit one of Grace's cigarettes, and inhaled the sharp, cold air. Smoke thinned into the night. The world remained large and indifferent. While the cigarette burned, he was not cold. September returned the next evening without apology. The wind had cleaned the street, but not the silence. Cooper came back to the same curb as if it were assigned to him. The boarded school watched with its empty sockets. The water towers no longer burned. They rusted quietly against a pale sky. He sat down with the care of an older man and placed a new piece of gray chalk on the asphalt. He did not look at yesterday's place. There was nothing left of it. He began again, writing slower this time. Symbols gathered like dry bones. A limit approached something it would never reach. The chalk squealed and broke in his fingers. He examined the fracture as though it were a small diagnosis, then continued with the shorter end. A dog barked somewhere beyond the vacant lots. No one else disturbed him. Grace crossed the street after her shift. She carried a paper bag and set it beside him without ceremony. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She watched his hand move. "Does it change?" she asked. "It behaves," he said. "That is enough." She nodded as if that answered more than she understood. The smell of gasoline lingered in the folds of her sleeves. When she left, the curb seemed slightly narrower. Cooper finished the line and leaned back. He remembered an office with a narrow window and a name once printed on a door. He remembered students arguing about proofs as if truth were negotiable. The memory did not ache. It weighed. He unwrapped the sandwich and ate without tasting it. Crumbs fell onto the equation. He brushed them away carefully, preserving the curve. The wind returned, less violent now, more patient. It lifted the edge of the wax paper and pressed dust into the chalk. The symbols softened, then thinned. Cooper watched the erasure as one watches dusk settle over fields. He did not hurry. When the last sign faded into a pale scar, he crushed the chalk between his fingers and let the powder fall. He stood and faced the highway. Headlights moved in the distance, like thoughts that did not belong to him. For a moment, he imagined stepping toward them. Instead, he remained where he was, breathing the cold that had advanced another inch into the town. The school behind him made no sound. In the darkening street, nothing demanded an answer. The third evening carried a colder edge. The sky was the color of tin, and the wind moved low along the ground, as if searching for something it had misplaced. Cooper did not sit immediately. He stood in the middle of the street and looked at the asphalt where yesterday's work had vanished. The road offered no memory. It accepted everything and kept nothing. He lowered himself onto the curb and placed the chalk beside him. For a while, he did not write. A freight train passed somewhere beyond the dry fields, its sound stretched thin by distance. He imagined the cars filled with grain, with steel, with things that still had destinations. Then he bent forward and began another equation. This one was shorter. It did not pretend to resolve. Grace watched from across the street before crossing. Her shift had ended. The pumps were dark. She carried 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and remained standing. "You could teach again," she said, not looking at him. He shook his head. "The room is gone." She did not ask which room. She knew better than to press against closed doors. He studied the line he had drawn. It was precise, almost careful enough to be hopeful. He remembered the first time he had written something that surprised him. He had believed then that clarity could save a man. Now clarity only confirmed the outline of the cage. He sipped the coffee. It was too hot, almost painful. He welcomed that. A gust of wind moved along the street and lifted dust into the air. The chalk blurred at the edges, but held. Cooper placed his palm over part of the formula, shielding it without thinking. The gesture surprised him. He removed his hand slowly, as if caught in a lie. When the wind eased, he stood. The equation remained faint but legible. He did not add to it. Instead, he left it unfinished, a line waiting for something that would not come. He walked toward the highway again, feeling the gravel shift under his shoes. Behind him, the town settled into night. The unfinished symbols lay on the road like quiet questions no one intended to answer. The 4th evening arrived without color. A thin frost clung to the edges of the sidewalk, whitening the cracks like old scars. Cooper noticed it when he sat down. The cold came up through the concrete and into his bones. He did not resist it. The school behind him looked smaller now, as if the weather had pressed it inward. He searched his pockets for chalk and found only dust. For a moment, he stared at his empty palm. Then he rose and walked to the edge of the vacant lot, where fragments of plaster and stone lay scattered. He chose a pale shard and returned to the street. It left a weaker mark, but it marked. He drew slowly. No letters this time, only a line intersecting another. The crossing was deliberate. He watched the 2 strokes meet, neither yielding. A truck rolled past, its headlights grazing him without stopping. The driver's radio carried a burst of laughter that vanished as quickly as it came. Grace approached with her hands in her jacket pockets. She did not bring coffee. She stood beside him and looked at the crossing lines. "Is that it?" she asked. "It's enough," he said. She studied the frost forming at the edges of the mark. "Winter doesn't solve anything." "No," he answered. "It only preserves." They remained there until the air grew sharper. The shard of plaster trembled in his fingers. He felt the urge to extend one of the lines, to bend it, to suggest direction. Instead, he let it remain as it was 2 strokes meeting and stopping. When the wind came, it did not erase the mark at once. It dulled it gradually, covering it with a thin veil of white. Cooper watched without expression. Loss had become patient. He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. The intersection faded behind him as he walked toward the highway, not faster, not slower, just forward, as if following a line only he could see. The 5th evening carried snow instead of wind. Not a storm, only a steady descent of white that seemed to fall without purpose. The town absorbed it quietly. Cooper stood for a moment before sitting, as if asking permission from the cold. The curb had grown harder. The school behind him was softened by the thin layer gathering on its boards. Even ruin could appear gentle under snow. He no longer searched his pockets for chalk. He pressed his finger into the powder on the asphalt and drew with that. The line appeared darker against the pale surface, a subtraction instead of an addition. He traced a simple curve, then another beside it. They did not meet. They ran parallel for a short distance before fading into the white. Grace crossed the street with slow steps, leaving shallow prints behind her. She carried nothing. She stood near him and watched his hand move. "You'll disappear with it," she said quietly. "Everything does," he replied. "Son just practiced earlier." She did not smile. Snow gathered in her hair and along the seam of her jacket. They looked at the two parallel lines. The falling flakes began to fill them, blurring their edges. Cooper remembered a theorem about limits, about approaching without touching. He had once explained it with patience, drawing arrows toward a point that remained intact. Now he saw that the arrows had been the only honest part. The point itself had never been reachable. The snow thickened. The curves vanished beneath it, as if they had never been there. Cooper stood, brushing the white from his sleeves. The highway lights glowed faintly through the curtain of falling snow. He hesitated, then stepped forward, his footprints crossing the place where the lines had been. Behind him, the town accepted the cover without protest. The sixth evening did not feel like an evening at all. The sky remained the same color from noon to dusk, a flat sheet pulled low over the town. Snow had hardened into a crust along the curb. Cooper tested it with his shoe before sitting. The air cut cleaner now. It left no room for hesitation. He did not draw immediately. He looked at the school doors, the boards swollen from moisture. Something had shifted in him during the night. Not hope, not despair, only a narrowing, as if the world had reduced itself to what could still be touched. He reached down and scraped a rectangle clear of snow with the edge of his hand. The asphalt showed through, dark and unadorned. From his coat pocket, he removed a stub of pencil. He must have found it somewhere. He pressed it against the exposed patch and wrote slowly. Not an equation. A sequence of numbers without symbols between them. They formed a date only he recognized. He underlined it once. Grace approached more cautiously now, as if nearing a wound. She saw the numbers and did not ask what they meant. "You're running out of room," she said. "I don't need much," he answered. She stood beside him while the cold worked its way into their shoes. The pencil left a faint mark. The snow crept inward again, softening the digits. Cooper did not shield them. He watched the white erase the underlined date until only an impression remained. He rose with effort. His joints protested but obeyed. Without turning back to the curb, he walked to the boarded door of the school once more. He placed his palm flat against the wood. It felt colder than the air. He did not try to enter. He only held the contact for a few seconds, as if confirming that something solid still existed. When he stepped away, the wind had begun again, light but persistent. The highway hummed in the distance. Cooper moved toward it, not hurried, not delayed. Behind him, the rectangle of cleared asphalt filled in completely, leaving no trace of numbers, no sign that they had been written. The town remained white and silent, as though nothing had required solving. The seventh evening arrived with a pale sun that never warmed the ground. The snow had thinned, pressed into gray patches along the curb. Cooper did not sit at once. He stood in the center of the street and listened. The town made small sounds now distant doors, a dog chain striking metal, the low hum of power lines. Life continuing without emphasis. He carried nothing in his hands. No chalk, no pencil. He knelt and brushed aside what remained of the snow, revealing the worn surface beneath. The asphalt looked tired, veined with cracks. He traced one of them with his finger. It curved unpredictably, indifferent to geometry. He followed it as far as it went. Grace did not cross the street this time. She watched from the gas station doorway, her arms folded against the cold. When their eyes met, she gave a slight nod, neither encouragement nor farewell. He understood it as permission. Cooper lay his palm flat on the crack and pressed down, as if feeling for a pulse. He remembered explaining to students that every system contains its own fracture. That perfection is an illusion sustained by distance. Up close, everything reveals its fault line. He had not excluded himself from that rule. A truck slowed near the intersection and continued on. The driver glanced briefly at him and looked away. Cooper stood and brushed his hands together. The crack remained. He had added nothing to it. He turned toward the highway once more. The light was fading, but not yet gone. He walked steadily, leaving the street as it was unwritten, uncorrected. Behind him, the school and the gas station settled back into their separate silences. The fracture in the asphalt waited without expectation, running through the town like a quiet, permanent answer. The bridge that stopped mourning comes without ceremony. The unfinished bridge stands over a dry riverbed, somewhere between Nebraska and Iowa, its concrete pillars rising like monuments to a promise withdrawn. Rust runs down the rebar, thin and patient. A yellow excavator sleeps in weeds. The wind pulls at a torn strip of caution tape, and it answers with a dry, nervous sound. Rayleigh sits on the hood of his pickup. The metal is already warm, though the sun has only begun its climb. His hands smell of diesel and old leather. He comes here every morning at 8, out of habit rather than duty. The drawings lie beside him, their edges curled and sunburned. Numbers once meant certainty. Now they are only ink. A dusty Ford passes along the county road. Milas lifts 2 fingers from the wheel without slowing. He does not ask when the bridge will be finished. He saw the first truck pour the foundations. He will see the weeds claim them. His silence carries no accusation, only time. Hannah arrives on foot from the gas station between the highways. She carries plastic-wrapped sandwiches. The refrigerator is crying again, she says. Everything does, sooner or later, Rayleigh's answers. They speak in fragments. She watches the pillars as if they were gravestones for a city she never reached. By evening, the air thickens with the smell of rain that does not fall. Rayleigh studies his signature in the corner of a blueprint. The letters look younger than his hands. He realizes that even if the money returned, the will would not. The bridge ends above emptiness, so does he. The next morning resembles the first. The bridge has not shifted, yet something in the light makes it appear more skeletal. Dust hangs low over the dry riverbed. A single crow stands on the highest beam, indifferent to height or failure. Rayleigh's arrives at 8. He parks in the same place, as if a line were painted there only he can see. The thermos burns his palm. The coffee is too strong and leaves a bitter trace in his throat. He welcomes it. It proves he can still feel something precise. He walks along the concrete edge, where the road stops abruptly. Rebar rises from the slab like broken ribs. He touches one, and rust powders his fingertips. Once he believed steel could outlast doubt. Now he sees how quickly air eats through certainty. Mila's truck passes again. Today the old farmer does not lift his hand. He keeps both on the wheel. The gesture is not withheld out of anger. It is simply no longer necessary. They have acknowledged each other enough. Hannah comes later, her uniform smelling faintly of gasoline and cheap detergent. She sits beside him on the warm hood. They do not look at each other. The wind moves between them like a third presence. Far off, thunder speaks without commitment. They wait, though neither expects rain. By the third day, the sky lowers itself closer to the pillars. The air is thick, metallic, as if the storm has been rehearsing for weeks and still refuses to begin. The excavator stands deeper in weeds. Yellow paint flakes like tired skin. Rayleigh's unfolds the drawings across the hood of the pickup. The paper trembles in the wind. Lines intersect with perfect intention. Distances are exact. Loads are calculated to the last decimal. He traces the span that should have connected both banks. His finger stops where the road simply ends. A truck slows on the highway, but does not turn in. For a moment, Rayleigh's imagines officials stepping out with new contracts and clean promises. The truck accelerates again. Dust follows it like an afterthought. Hannah brings no sandwiches today. She carries only a cigarette between two fingers. They're cutting ours, she says. They cut the bridge first, he replies. The words fall flat, without bitterness. She nods. She understands subtraction. Toward evening, he finds his old level in the toolbox. He sets it carefully on the unfinished edge. The bubble inside trembles, searching for balance on ground that leads nowhere. Rayleigh watches it settle in the center. Even here, the instrument insists on equilibrium. He wonders if that is strength or blindness. Night comes with dry lightning. The sky tears open in silence. For a second, the pillars glow white, then return to shadow. No rain follows. The riverbed remains a scar of dust and stone. Rayleigh stands beneath the span that was never finished. The concrete above him holds its weight without purpose. He remembers the first day of pouring, the noise of engines, men shouting measurements over wind. Back then, the bridge had a future. Now it has only height. Milas parks by the roadside and steps out. He does not approach immediately. He looks at the structure the way a farmer looks at a field that will not yield. Storms dry, he says at last. They usually are, Rayleigh answers. The words do not belong to either of them. Hannah waits in the pickup, radio whispering static and distant country music. Smoke gathers in the cab. She watches the lightning reflect in the windshield. It makes the glass look cracked, though it is not. When the sky grows quiet again, Rayleigh walks to the edge, where the slab ends in open air. He does not look down. He places his palm against the rough concrete and feels nothing move beneath it. The bridge is solid. The absence beyond it is more so. Dawn stains the sky, a tired shade of pink. The storm has passed without leaving a mark. The pillars stand as they did yesterday, and the riverbed keeps its silence. Dew gathers on the rusted rebar, thin as sweat on old skin. Rayleigh sits inside the pickup with the engine running. The vibration travels through the steering wheel into his hands. It is a small, obedient force. Machines still respond when asked. He lets the motor idle longer than necessary, as if motion might begin by accident. Hannah stands outside with a paper cup. The coffee has gone cold before she can finish it. She does not complain. They're talking about closing the station at night, she says. Less traffic, he answers. They both know traffic was never the reason. Milas drives past once more. This time he stops. He studies the bridge and then the two figures beside it. Weeds grow quick, he says. It is neither warning nor comfort, just fact. He returns to his truck without waiting for reply. Rayleigh turns off the engine. The sudden quiet presses in. He gathers the drawings and leaves them on the concrete block near the edge. The wind lifts a corner, but does not carry them away. The day has begun. That is all it promises. The heat arrives early. By mid-morning, the air above the concrete trembles, bending the pillars into wavering shapes. The caution tape has finally torn loose. It lies in the weeds like a shed skin. Rayleigh does not bring the drawings today. His hands are empty when he climbs from the pickup. He walks the length of the slab and stops where the road ends in open air. Below, the riverbed holds only stone and pale dust. It looks less like a fall than an erasure. Hannah comes later than usual. She leans against the truck, arms folded. They're selling the pumps, she says. Company's pulling out. He nods. Everything pulls out eventually. There is no sharpness in his voice, only recognition. Milas does not pass this time. The road remains empty. The silence feels heavier without the brief exchange of two raised fingers. Rayleigh notices how quickly absence becomes routine. Toward evening, he picks up the old level from the edge and sets it back in the toolbox. The bubble settles, indifferent to landscape. He closes the lid and wipes the rust from his fingertips onto his jeans. The bridge stands unfinished behind him. He does not look back. The following morning carries a thinner light. The sky is washed out, almost colorless, as if even dawn has grown careful. Dust drifts across the empty span and settles in the seams of the concrete. The bridge no longer appears abandoned. It simply appears unnecessary. Rayleigh parks farther away than usual. He remains inside the truck for a long time, hands resting on the wheel. The key is turned, but the engine stays silent. He listens to the wind move through the open window. It sounds like distant traffic that never arrives. Hannah walks up the dirt path without a bag in her hand. Her uniform shirt is folded over her arm. "Last shift was yesterday," she says. She does not explain further. There is nothing to explain. She sits on the edge of the slab, legs dangling above the dry riverbed, and watches the horizon. They do not speak about leaving. The idea hangs between them like heat. Rayleigh steps to the place where the road stops and studies the opposite bank. It is close enough to measure, far enough to remain untouched. He tries to imagine the asphalt reaching it. The image refuses to hold. By afternoon, the wind strengthens. A sheet of old blueprint paper lifts from the weeds and skims across the concrete before disappearing over the edge. Neither of them moves to catch it. The bridge stands patient and incomplete. The day moves on without instruction. The caretaker of empty light, morning in Nebraska, arrives without light. The villa stands open to the fields like a broken jaw of glass and concrete. Frank sits on a plastic chair that was once white. Now it carries the color of old chalk and damp hands. In front of him, the Olympic pool has forgotten blue. The water is thick, the shade of abandoned tea. At the bottom lies a child's tricycle, turned on its side, furred with algae. Things here weigh more than men. He moves the net across the surface. Leaves gather, then drift apart again. The pole complains in a thin wooden voice. Wind returns what he removes. Frank does not hurry. Time here has no direction. It only lasts. When Ed's old Ford coughs at the gate, blue smoke hanging low, Frank does not turn at once. The newspaper lands on stone. A nod passes between them, short and dry. Ed says something about rain. It sounds like every other sentence he has ever spoken. The filter pump stops by noon. Frank lifts the lid and reaches into the dark throat of it. His hand closes around leather. A woman's shoe, once expensive, heel snapped, lining undone. In water, it has grown heavy and patient. He studies it as if it were an animal pulled from a trap. Leather does not forgive water. It only absorbs and waits. For a moment, he thinks of Mary, not her face, only the way her name used to rest in his mouth, warm and certain. Now it feels like a coin dropped in tall grass. The sun touches the broken glass walls and scatters into pale shards. He smokes and watches the light slide over the shoe. There were no parties here that he remembers, only ownership. Ownership is louder than laughter. By evening, the sky lowers itself. Rain comes without anger. Frank pulls the starter cord of the generator until his palms split. The machine resists with the indifference of metal. Gasoline mixes with wet grass. When the engine finally dies for good, he lets the cord fall. The pool rises under the rain, swelling to the marble edge. He stands without shelter and watches it spill over. It is not a disaster. It is correction. Rain continues through the night and stops without apology. By morning, the pool has reached the lawn. The marble edge is hidden beneath a thin, brown overflow. Frank stands at the steps with his boots in the water. It is colder than he expected. Cold is honest. It does not pretend to be anything else. Ed returns late in the day. The Ford rattles as if something inside it is loose, but still holding. He brings no mail this time, only a package that was misdelivered, and a question he does not ask. They stand under the cracked overhang. Ed looks at the water and whistles once. Bad drainage, he says. It is the kind of sentence men use when they mean something larger. Frank shrugs. The estate was built to impress, not to endure. After Ed leaves, the silence grows thicker. Frank walks the perimeter of the villa. The glass walls mirror the fields and fragments. In one pane he sees himself, bent slightly forward, as if the wind has been pushing him for years. Inside, dust lies over white floors like a second skin. He pauses by a grand staircase that leads nowhere important anymore. His footsteps echo as though someone is following at a careful distance. In a drawer near the kitchen, he finds a photograph curled at the edges. Mary stands beside a car that no longer exists. Her smile is steady, almost patient. He studies the image until it loses detail and becomes paper again. He places it back without straightening it. Memory is a room that should not be aired too often. Toward evening, a black SUV slows at the gate. A young couple steps out, dressed for a world that still believes in renovation. They photograph the ruin as if it were scenery prepared for them. Frank watches from behind the curtain of dust. They do not see him. They laugh beside the swollen pool, calling it atmospheric. When they leave, their tires cut clean lines in the mud. The lines will not last. The mud at the gate dries into brittle skin by noon. The tire marks fade first at the edges, then at the center. Frank studies them as if they were a message left in a language he once knew. The fields beyond the fence move in a low wind. Nothing here asks to be remembered. He takes the generator apart on a wooden crate behind the shed. Screws lie in a careful row. The carburetor is clogged with old fuel that smells sweet and rotten. He cleans it with a rag that used to be a shirt. His fingers work slowly, as if repairing the machine were a courtesy extended to metal, not a necessity. When he pulls the cord again, the engine coughs once and falls silent. That is enough of an answer. Ed passes in the afternoon without stopping. He lifts 2 fingers from the steering wheel. The gesture hangs in the air longer than the truck's smoke. Frank lifts his hand in return. Words would only complicate what both of them already know. Deliveries continue, even when there is nothing left worth delivering. Inside the villa, the pool water has settled. The tricycle at the bottom looks closer now, as if the rain has lowered the distance between surface and memory. Frank kneels at the edge and touches the water with his fingertips. It leaves a faint film on his skin. He wipes it on his trousers. There was a time when he believed maintenance could postpone decay. Now he understands that decay is only another form of patience. At dusk, he sits on the lowest step, boots submerged. The sky clears into a pale, indifferent blue. He opens the plastic bottle of whiskey and takes a measured swallow. It burns without drama. Across the fields, a train moves somewhere unseen, its sound flat and distant. Frank listens until the sound disappears. Then he remains, as if waiting for it to return. Night settles without ceremony. The villa absorbs it the way stone absorbs cold. Frank sits in the caretaker's shack with a can of beans opened by a knife that has outlived its handle. He eats slowly. The beans are cold. Cold food demands no expectation. On the table lies Mary's photograph. He places his cup on it to keep the wood from staining. Paper is practical. Memory should be too. The radio offers only static between distant stations. The sound resembles surf, though there is no ocean within 1,000 miles. Frank lets it run. Silence can become too complete. Static is at least a reminder that something moves elsewhere. He leans back in the chair and studies the ceiling stain that widens each time it rains. Water finds its path. It always does. Near midnight, he steps outside. The moon hangs low, turning the pool into a sheet of dull mercury. From a distance, it could pass for beauty. Up close, it smells of algae and iron. He walks along the marble edge and feels the stone under his boots, smooth and indifferent. A frog has taken residence in the shallow end. It watches him without fear. Ownership changes quickly in abandoned places. He picks up a small stone and weighs it in his palm. For a moment, he considers the arc it will make. Then he throws it into the center. The splash is brief. Circles widen, hesitate, and fade. The surface returns to stillness, as if nothing had touched it. That is how most things end here. Before dawn, he lights a cigarette. The smoke rises straight up. There is no wind. He watches it until it thins and disappears into the pale air. Morning will come again, and with it the net, the leaves, the slow sweep across water that does not wish to be cleared. He stands and waits for the light to become strong enough to begin. Dawn arrives in a thin, colorless band above the fields. The villa stands as it did yesterday and the day before. Nothing has improved. Nothing has worsened enough to matter. Frank washes his face at the outdoor tap. The water runs brown for a second, then clears. He dries his hands on his trousers and looks at the pool as if it were a task assigned long ago and never revised. He takes the net again. The motion is familiar, almost gentle. Leaves collect, insects cling to the mesh, then slide back into the water when he lifts it too slowly. He does not curse. Anger requires expectation. The tricycle at the bottom seems closer in the pale light. Its small handlebar cuts a crooked line through the green. It was built for movement. Now it anchors the deep. Ed stops that morning and actually kills the engine. The sudden silence is heavier than the motor's noise. He steps out, boots sinking slightly into damp soil. County's talking about auctioning the place, he says, eyes on the water. Taxes. The word lands between them like a stone no one will pick up. Frank nods once. Auctions are for things with futures. Ruins are patient. After Ed leaves, Frank walks through the villa's main hall. Dust shifts under his boots. He pauses before the wide glass wall that once framed sunsets for people who believed glass could hold back time. His reflection stands faint and incomplete, cut by cracks. He touches the pane with 2 fingers. It feels colder than it should. By evening, he sits again at the pool's edge. He pours the last of the whiskey into a plastic cup and does not raise it in any gesture. The water is still. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barks and then grows tired of it. Frank lowers his boots into the shallow step. The cold moves through the leather and into him. He does not withdraw. Some things are easier to endure when they are steady. The morning after the word auction carries no new color. The sky is a flat sheet of gray, stretched tight above the fields. Frank walks the perimeter fence with a hammer in his hand. One board has come loose. He nails it back without measuring. The wood splits slightly. It will hold for a while. Holding is a modest ambition. By noon, a county truck appears at the gate. Not Ed's Ford, a different engine, cleaner, impatient. A man in a pressed shirt steps out and studies the house through dark glasses. He does not remove them. Paperwork rests under his arm like a shield. He speaks of inspection, liability, future use. His words are polished. They slide over the cracked marble and fall into the pool without echo. Frank listens. He answers only what is necessary. Yes, the generator works sometimes. No, there have been no trespassers worth mentioning. The man walks to the edge of the water and makes a small note on his pad. He does not see the tricycle beneath the surface. He sees only a number, a figure to be entered later into a system that does not smell the algae. When the truck leaves, dust hangs in the air a few seconds longer than needed. Frank returns to the caretaker's shack and folds Mary's photograph once, then unfolds it again. The crease remains faint but visible. He places it back on the table and sets nothing on top of it this time. Paper can carry weight only so long. At dusk he stands by the pool and measures the waterline with his eyes. It has lowered a little. Evaporation is quiet work. He takes the net and draws it slowly across the surface. The pole creaks in the same tired voice. There is no thought of renewal, only continuation. The villa waits. The fields wait. Frank remains where waiting has become indistinguishable from living. Wind comes from the west that evening, thin and restless. It moves across the fields and strikes the glass walls with a low, steady breath. Inside the villa, a loose pane trembles in its frame. The sound repeats at intervals, like a weak pulse. Frank sits on the pool step and listens. There is no urgency in it, only persistence. He walks through the empty rooms with a flashlight, whose beam has begun to yellow at the edges. In the ballroom, if it can still be called that, dust shifts in slow spirals. A chandelier hangs above him, its crystals dulled, some missing. He imagines the weight it once carried when lit. Now it holds only silence. He switches off the light and lets the dark settle naturally. At the kitchen counter, he finds an unopened bottle of mineral water. The label is expensive, the brand foreign. He twists the cap and drinks directly from it. The water tastes flat, metallic from long storage. He leaves the bottle half empty. Even sealed things lose clarity when left untouched. Later, he hears the gate rattle. Not Ed. A group of boys stands outside the fence, their voices sharp, curious. They dare one another to climb. One of them does. Frank steps into view before the boys' feet touch ground. There is no shouting. He simply stands, hands at his sides. The boy hesitates, then drops back down the way he came. Laughter fades quickly once distance grows. Night thickens. Frank returns to the pool and sits again, boots resting on damp stone. The frog is gone. In its place, the water holds only its own reflection of the sky. He lights a cigarette and watches the ember burn down in a straight line. When it reaches his fingers, he lets it fall into the water. The hiss is brief. The surface closes without comment. The next morning carries a sharper wind. The fields lean in one direction, as if instructed. Frank wakes before light and sits at the small table in the shack. Mary's photograph lies where he left it. The crease has deepened overnight. Paper remembers pressure better than men do. He walks to the main house and notices a crack running longer across the glass wall. It was there before, only shorter. Expansion is a quiet form of surrender. Inside, a door swings slowly on one hinge. Each movement ends with a soft knock against the frame. The house is learning to speak in small sounds. Ed arrives near noon, engine rougher than usual. He brings a letter this time. Official paper, county seal, language that pretends to be neutral. Frank reads it once, then folds it carefully. 30 days. The number does not surprise him. He hands the paper back to Ed for a moment, as if to confirm its weight. Ed shrugs. They'll level it, he says. Probably quicker that way. Quicker is not always better. After the truck leaves, Frank walks to the pool and studies the tricycle again. The water has cleared slightly in the wind. He can see the rust beginning along the chain. He considers draining the pool entirely. The thought feels excessive, almost theatrical. Instead, he sits on the edge and lets his boots hang above the surface without touching it. At dusk, he enters the villa one more time and stands in the largest room. The sky behind the glass turns a pale orange that lasts only minutes. From a distance, the house appears almost intentional again, as if designed for this 1 hour of beauty. Frank does not step closer to the window. Some views are easier to hold when they remain incomplete. He turns away before the light fades. 30 days become a number that moves with him. Frank marks nothing on the wall. He keeps the count in his head, the way men once counted miles between towns. The days do not feel shorter. They simply feel numbered. There is a difference. He begins to sort what little belongs to him. A spare shirt, 2 tools that still function, a tin box with coins that have lost their shine. The shack looks smaller when objects are lifted from their places. Space reveals itself as something temporary. He folds Mary's photograph along the old crease and slides it into the inside pocket of his jacket. This time he does not unfold it again. Ed stops more often now, as if proximity might soften the deadline. He speaks about other jobs, about a storage yard hiring night watch. Frank listens without committing. The idea of another gate, another stretch of gravel to patrol, feels neither hopeful nor heavy. It is simply another perimeter. One afternoon, Frank drags a hose toward the pool and opens the valve. The water runs weakly at first, then steadier. He lets it spill onto the grass instead of into the basin. The pool does not need more. He watches the surface drop by a fraction. The tricycle emerges clearer, its red paint faded to something close to brown. It no longer resembles a toy. It resembles scrap. On the 29th evening, he sits at the edge and lowers his boots into the water one last time. The cold climbs slowly through leather and bone. He does not drink. He does not smoke. The fields are still. In the distance, a train passes unseen, carrying weight toward another state. The sound travels, then thins, then disappears. Frank remains until the dark is complete, as if waiting for permission that does not arrive. The final morning arrives without distinction. The sky is the same dull gray, the fields the same flattened stretch of patience. Frank wakes before light and stands for a moment in the doorway of the shack. The air carries the faint smell of damp earth and metal. He closes the door behind him without locking it. A county truck waits at the gate when the sun begins to thin the horizon. Two men step out, boots clean, gloves new. They nod at Frank as if greeting a colleague, not replacing him. Paper is signed on the hood of the truck. The pen scratches briefly. The sound is sharper than the wind. Frank walks to the pool one last time. The water has lowered enough to reveal the tricycle's front wheel breaking the surface. Rust has eaten into the spokes. He takes the net and draws it once across the water, slow and deliberate. Leaves gather. He lifts them out and lets them fall onto the stone. There is no reason for it. Habit is sufficient. He turns toward the villa and studies the glass walls. In the early light, they reflect only the fields. The cracks are invisible from a distance. For a second, the house appears whole, almost proud. Frank does not correct the illusion. Illusions are lighter than truth. He takes Mary's photograph from his pocket and looks at it without unfolding the crease. Then he slides it back inside his jacket. The men behind him begin unloading equipment. Engines start. Metal prepares to meet glass. Frank walks past the gate and onto the road without looking back. The wind rises slightly, carrying dust across the entrance. Within minutes, his footsteps are gone. Where the light dies, the room smells of cheap cleanser and old tobacco. Outside the window, the Nebraska plains lie flat and indifferent, cut now and then by the distant sweep of headlights. In the motel called Neon Palms, the world does not end. It simply pauses. Thomas sits on the edge of the bed and watches a dusty lamp tremble in its own weak light. The chair near the door creaks without being touched. A stain on the ceiling resembles a country he has never visited and never will. On the knitstand lies his phone. The screen is shattered into fine, stubborn veins. When he drags his thumb across it, a faint grit remains on his skin. It is the only window to what used to be, and the window is broken. The blue glow breathes weakly, like an injured animal that refuses to die. Tomas studies it with the patience he once reserved for long highways. He lights a cigarette. The smoke rises straight upward. The air in the room has stopped moving. He tries to remember a number, not a name only, the sequence of digits that once meant home. Behind the thin wall, a woman coughs, then water runs through old pipes. The sound is more honest than any conversation. The phone vibrates once without reason. He waits for it to speak again. He begins to type. The screen does not answer unless he presses harder. A sharp edge opens the skin of his thumb. A small drop of blood falls onto the glowing glass and spreads across the fractured light. The pain is slight, almost useful. It proves he is still present. He does not wipe the blood away. The red distorts the letters as if the word itself were ashamed. Images come, not faces but fragments. A ring of peas on a table, rain crawling down a windshield, laughter that rang like thin metal. He tries to write, "Sorry." The screen freezes on the first letter. The A repeats, filling the space without sound. Then the light dies. The room grows heavier. Tomas sits with his bleeding hand and listens to the silence. He is afraid of it, but he no longer reaches for anything to break it. Night settles without ceremony. Tomas remains on the bed, listening to the pipes cool behind the wall. The woman coughs again, shorter this time, as if even her lungs are tired of insisting. He wonders what she looks like, then decides it does not matter. A voice is enough. A cough is enough. It is proof that someone else is failing to sleep. He opens the drawer and takes the dead phone back into his hand. The screen reflects nothing now, only a dull shadow. He presses the button. No light answers. For a moment, he considers smashing it against the sink, finishing what the cracks have begun. Instead, he sets it on the table with care, like a fragile relic from a war nobody remembers. He lies down fully dressed. The mattress sags in the middle, pulling him toward its hollow. He thinks of the highways he once drove, long black ribbons unrolling beneath his headlights. Back then, silence belonged to distance. It was wide and clean. Here, it is narrow. It presses against his ears. Behind the wall, the woman begins to speak softly, perhaps into her own phone, perhaps to no one. The words are too blurred to understand. Tomas closes his eyes and imagines she is speaking to him. Not because he believes it, but because the thought fills the room for a few seconds. It is easier to borrow a voice than to endure the absence of one. Near dawn, a truck passes and its light crawls across the ceiling like a slow blade. Tomas does not move. He understands now that nothing waits for him on the other side of any call. Morning will come whether he answers it or not. He breathes evenly, as if already practicing for a life, without signals, without glass, without the need to press harder to be heard. Morning enters the room without color. The sky above the plains is pale and undecided. Tomas wakes before the light reaches his face. For a moment, he does not remember where he is. Then the smell of cleanser and tobacco returns, and the ceiling stain settles back into its place above him. He sits up slowly. The cut on his thumb has dried into a thin, dark line. It does not hurt. On the table, the phone lies inert, its cracked surface dull as stone. He turns it over in his hand, weighing it. It feels lighter than it should, as if the words it once carried have already evaporated. In the parking lot, a truck engine starts and idles. The sound is steady, patient. Tomas watches through the curtain as a driver climbs into the cab and pulls away without hesitation. The red taillights shrink into the flat horizon. There is no ceremony in departure. The road accepts anyone. Behind the wall, the woman moves about. A cupboard door closes. Water runs again. Ordinary sounds. He realizes he does not need to see her. Her existence is enough to keep the silence from hardening completely. Two strangers breathing through plaster, separated but aligned in their wakefulness. Tomas dresses and puts the phone back into the drawer. Not out of hope, but out of order. Some objects deserve to be put away rather than destroyed. He opens the door and steps into the thin morning air. The plains stretch outward without promise. He does not look back at the window. The day will move forward on its own. He follows it because there is nothing else to follow. The diner across the lot opens at 6. Tomas sits at the counter with both hands around a chipped cup of coffee. The steam rises and disappears before it reaches his face. The waitress wipes the same strip of counter again and again, as if polishing memory itself. Outside, trucks pass without slowing. The world continues its work. He eats slowly. The toast tastes of nothing. Grease lingers in the air, mixed with detergent and burnt oil. A radio murmurs from somewhere behind the kitchen door, but the words dissolve before they become meaning. Tomas listens to the hum of refrigeration units and the low scrape of plates. These sounds ask nothing from him. His thumb leaves a faint mark on the white porcelain. The cut has opened slightly. A thin line of red stains the rim of the cup. He studies it without emotion. Pain has become an inventory item, like the chair in his room or the cracked screen in the drawer. It is proof of use. Through the window, he sees the woman from the neighboring room for the first time. She stands by the vending machine, her back turned, coat too thin for the wind. She does not look toward the diner. For a second, he considers raising his hand. He does not. Recognition would require explanation. She walks toward the highway and disappears beyond the fuel pumps. Tomas finishes his coffee and leaves a few bills on the counter. He steps outside into the wide Nebraska light. The road lies open in both directions. He chooses one without thinking. Movement is not hope. It is only the refusal to remain still. The wind meets him without warmth. It carries dust from the fields and lays it against his coat. Tomas walks along the edge of the highway until the motel sign is no longer visible. The letters of neon palms flicker once in the distance, then vanish behind a curve. Nothing calls him back. He reaches the truck stop a mile away. Fuel pumps stand like tired sentries. A driver sleeps in his cab with the engine running, exhaust drifting low across the asphalt. Tomas rests his hand on the metal of a parked trailer. It is cold and solid. Machines do not hesitate. They wait for instruction. Inside the station, fluorescent lights flatten every shadow. Shelves are lined with maps, plastic-wrapped sandwiches, batteries. He studies the maps without unfolding them. Lines cross the country in patient grids. Each route promises arrival. None mentions what remains after arrival. At the counter, he pays for a bottle of water. The cashier does not look at him. Their exchange is exact and brief. Tomas appreciates this. Words, when unnecessary, are a form of noise. He steps back outside and drinks slowly, feeling the water move down his throat like a measured answer. A freight truck pulls away from the pumps and turns east. For a moment, he considers asking for a ride. The thought passes without struggle. He understands now that the road is not escape. It is repetition. He stands still until the dust settles, then turns his back on the highway and begins to walk parallel to it, close enough to hear its breath, far enough not to belong to it. By noon, the sun has burned the softness out of the sky. Tomas sits beneath a narrow strip of shade cast by a storage shed behind the truck stop. The metal wall radiates heat against his back. He watches the traffic without following it with his eyes. Movement has become background, like wind. He takes the dead phone from his pocket. He does not remember putting it there. The glass catches the light and throws it back in fractured lines. For a moment, he sees his own reflection divided into pieces. It seems accurate. He presses the button again, though he knows the result. Nothing answers. A memory surfaces without warning. The sound of tires on wet pavement, a voice speaking his name from the passenger seat, calm and tired. He does not try to complete the image. Fragments are safer than whole scenes. They cannot accuse him of what he failed to hold together. Across the lot, a child runs between the pumps, while a man shouts half-heartedly after him. The shout carries irritation, not fear. Tomas listens to it as one listens to a distant siren aware, detached. Life continues in small, careless gestures. It does not pause for private ruins. He places the phone on the ground beside him and presses his heel down on the cracked screen. The glass gives way with a muted crunch. He lifts his foot. The surface is crushed beyond repair. There is no relief in the act, only completion. He leaves the fragments where they lie and stands up. The silence remains, but it no longer expects to be answered. He walks until the truck stop noise dissolves into wind. The fields lie open and exhausted, the color of old rope. Gravel shifts under his boots. Each step sounds louder than it should. When he looks back, the storage sheds and fuel pumps have already flattened into the horizon. A line of abandoned machinery stands near a dried irrigation ditch, rusted tractors, a trailer without wheels. Tomas sits on the edge of the ditch and rests his hands on his knees. The cut on his thumb has reopened. A thin thread of blood moves slowly toward his palm. He watches it without urgency. The body continues its quiet work. From far off, a freight train moves across the plain. Its shape is long and patient, dragging steel behind it like a thought that refuses to end. The sound arrives late, a dull rhythm against the air. Tomas remembers nights in the cab of his truck, engine humming beneath him, headlights carving a narrow certainty through darkness. Back then the road was a direction. Now it is only distance. He closes his eyes. For a moment, there is nothing but wind pressing against his face. No cough through a wall, no vibration in his pocket. Silence, complete and undivided. It does not threaten him. It simply exists. He understands that he has been fighting it as if it were an enemy. When he stands, he does not return to the highway. He follows the dry ditch instead, walking along its shallow curve. The ground is uneven but steady. There are no signs, no mile markers. Only the quiet line cut into earth by water that once moved and then stopped. He walks beside it without expectation, carrying nothing that can break. By late afternoon, the ditch widens and fades into a stretch of scrub and pale grass. Tomas walks without measuring the distance. The sun lowers, flattening the land into long shadows. His throat is dry again, but he does not turn back. Thirst is simple. It asks only for time. He finds an overturned crate near a collapsed fence and sits. The wood splinters beneath his weight. In the distance, the highway hum continues, steady and indifferent. He imagines the motel room already rented to someone else. The drawer opened, the absence unnoticed. Objects adjust quickly to new hands. The wind grows colder as the light thins. He presses his thumb against his palm to stop the slow bleeding. The cut has deepened from the crushed glass. It stings now, honest and direct. He prefers it to memory. Pain has edges. Memory spreads without shape. For a moment, he considers returning to the motel, to the diner, to the woman whose cough filled the wall between them. The thought arrives and leaves without weight. He understands that proximity is not connection. Two lives can share plaster and still remain separate continents. When the first star appears, he lies back in the grass. The sky stretches above him without promise. He breathes evenly, listening to the distant traffic like surf against a far shore. Nothing calls his name. Nothing demands apology. The world continues in its vast, mechanical patience, and he allows it to move without him trying to hold it together. Pawnshop light. Rain had not started yet, but the air already carried its weight. Sam sat inside the old Ford pickup in the parking lot of Miller's Diner. Ohio pressed flat around him like a faded photograph. The highway breathed somewhere beyond the neon sign, a long animal sound of tires on wet asphalt. Dust covered the dashboard in a thin gray skin. He drew a line through it with his finger and watched the mark remain. Some traces did. It counted time better than clocks. That morning there had been only the empty pill bottle on the table and Harry sitting still, looking at nothing. Sam had taken the bottle without a word. Between them, a nod meant, "I am still here." It was enough. Inside the pawn shop, called Silver and Gold, The air conditioner rattled like distant gunfire. A young clerk with headphones turned the metal over with a screwdriver, testing its edge as if it were scrap. The silver star lay on the counter, dull under fluorescent light. It weighed almost nothing. In Sam's palm, it felt heavier than it had in the desert. The money was less than a course of treatment, but he did not argue. He watched his reflection in the glass hands that once held a rifle, now trembling around folded bills. It was only metal for paper, chemistry for chemistry. Outside, clouds gathered without drama. He stepped back into the parking lot, the taste of iron already rising in his mouth, and understood that nothing had been sold except weight. The pharmacy stood beside the Walmart like an afterthought, its windows too clean for the town around it. Fluorescent light flattened every face into the same pale surface. Sam waited in line behind a young mother whose child cried without strength, as if even protest required more energy than the day allowed. He kept his eyes on the linoleum floor. The tiles were cracked in places, repaired badly. He understood that kind of repair. When his turn came, he placed the folded bills and the empty bottle on the counter. The pharmacist did not look up for long. Her fingers moved with professional calm, counting tablets into a new container, printing a label, sliding the paper bag across the surface. No one thanked him for anything. The transaction was clean. Money for time, nothing more. Outside, a rack of faded flyers leaned against the wall. Veterans Discount, Support Our Heroes, printed in patriotic colors already bleached by sun. The edges curled inward. Sam paused, then moved on. Discounts were a polite way of forgetting. He drove back to the motel with the radio off. The highway hissed under the first thin drops of rain. Each truck that passed shook his pickup slightly, as if reminding it of its age. The velvet box was gone from the passenger seat. In its place lay the pharmacy bag, light and anonymous. It did not look important. It only held hours. Harry was awake when Sam entered the room. The oxygen machine resumed its steady breathing, mechanical and loyal. Sam set the bag on the table without ceremony. Harry glanced at it, then at Sam. No gratitude passed between them, just the small acknowledgement of continuation. Later, outside under the sagging roof, Sam lit a cigarette. Rain thickened, turning dust into gray paste around his boots. The smoke settled in his lungs and stayed there, warm and heavy. For a moment, the metal taste faded. The world did not improve. It simply endured, and so did he. Night settled over the motel without transition. The neon sign outside flickered in uneven pulses, staining the wet pavement red and then withdrawing it again. Inside, Harry slept in short, shallow stretches. The oxygen machine kept its rhythm. Sam sat in the only chair, elbows on his knees, listening to the mechanical breath measure what was left. The room smelled of damp carpet and antiseptic. Water crept along the window frame. The gesture was automatic. Care had replaced conversation. Between them, silence had thickened into something almost solid, but it did not suffocate. It simply remained. On the table lay the pawn ticket, folded twice. Sam turned it over with his thumb. A date was printed there, an expiration. Metal could be reclaimed if one paid enough. Time could not. He slipped the ticket into his wallet, not out of hope, but habit. Men like him kept small proofs that something had once existed. Toward morning, the rain stopped. The highway resumed its distant murmur, indifferent and steady. Sam stepped outside. The air was cooler now, washed thin. He tasted nothing but smoke and the faint trace of iron at the back of his throat. The night had taken nothing and given nothing. It had only passed. Morning arrived without color. The clouds had thinned but left a residue in the sky, a pale film over everything. Sam had not slept. He stood by the vending machine outside the motel office, watching the coils turn empty behind scratched glass. The coffee inside the paper cup tasted of rusted pipes. He drank it anyway. In the room, Harry's machine still breathed. The sound was weaker now, as if it came from deeper underground. Sam counted the pauses between each mechanical sigh. He told himself he was only listening, not measuring. The pharmacy bag lay open on the table. One blister pack had already been pressed through, small silver circles missing from their places. Harry opened his eyes once. They were clearer than the day before. He looked at Sam with something like apology, though neither man had asked for forgiveness. Sam nodded. It meant, stay. It meant, I am here. Words would have been excessive. Around noon, the machine gave a long, uneven hum and then settled into silence. The room did not change. The carpet remained damp. The air conditioner in the wall rattled once and continued. Sam waited, counting, as if another breath might arrive late. None did. He stepped outside again. The highway shimmered in the distance, trucks moving steadily toward somewhere else. In his pocket, the pawn ticket pressed against his thigh. It had weight, but not purpose. He realized that the metal had already been exchanged twice, first for a symbol, then for tablets, now for nothing at all. Sam lit a cigarette and let the smoke rest in his lungs before releasing it. There was no sudden grief, no gesture large enough to hold it. Only a thinning, like dust lifted by passing traffic. The taste of metal returned, faint but certain. He did not wipe it away. He stood there until the ash reached his fingers, then dropped it onto the wet ground and watched it fade. The ambulance came without sirens. Two men in clean uniforms moved through the motel corridor with quiet efficiency, as if collecting something already accounted for. Sam stood aside. He had folded Harry's hands because it seemed appropriate, though he did not know why. The oxygen machine remained plugged into the wall, humming faintly until one of the men switched it off. The silence that followed was thinner than he expected. They asked a few questions. Name, age, next of kin. Sam answered what he could. There were gaps. The clipboard did not pause for them. When they wheeled Harry out under the washed sky, the sheet rose and fell slightly with the motion of the cart. It was only the movement of wheels over uneven concrete. Inside the room, the air felt larger. The second bed was untouched. On the table lay the empty blister pack and the crumpled paper bag. Sam gathered them and placed them in the trash without looking. Care ended in small gestures. Nothing marked the moment except the absence of breath. He sat on the edge of his own bed and removed his boots. Mud had dried in pale streaks along the leather. He scraped it off with a coin, watching the flakes fall to the floor. Dirt always returned to dust. Metal remained metal. He held the coin for a moment longer than necessary, feeling its edge against his thumb. Toward evening, he walked to the parking lot. The Ford waited where he had left it, patient and unchanged. He opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. The passenger seat was empty now. No velvet box, no pharmacy bag, only fabric worn smooth by years. He started the engine. It coughed once, then settled into a steady vibration. The highway called in its usual voice, neither inviting nor refusing. Sam pulled out slowly, merging with the traffic that moved without memory. There was no destination decided, only motion, and the faint metallic taste that did not leave his mouth. He drove west without choosing to. The highway accepted him the way it accepted freight and weather without recognition. Fields stretched flat on either side, late-season corn bending under a wind that carried no direction. The sky had cleared into a thin, colorless blue. It did not promise anything. The truck's engine vibrated through the steering wheel into his palms. Sam kept both hands steady, though there was nowhere urgent to go. At a rest stop near a line of skeletal trees, he pulled over and turned off the ignition. Silence rushed in, thick and immediate. For a moment, he thought he still heard the oxygen machine. He stepped out and walked toward the edge of the lot where gravel met scrub grass. The air smelled faintly of fuel and wet soil. In his wallet, the pawn ticket remained folded. He took it out and read the date again. It meant nothing now. He tore it once, then again, letting the pieces fall into the trash bin beside the picnic table. Paper was easier to discard than memory. Back in the truck, he opened the glove compartment. Inside lay an old service photograph, edges curled, colors fading into brown. 3 men stood too close to one another under a white sun. One of them was him. He studied the face without recognition, then closed the compartment gently. Evening approached in long horizontal shadows. Trucks passed, their trailers reflecting brief flashes of light into his windshield. Sam started the engine once more and returned to the road. There was no ceremony in the departure, only the steady hum of tires and the faint metal taste that remained, quieter now, as if distance could dilute it, but never remove it. By the time darkness settled, the highway had thinned. Fewer trucks, longer stretches between headlights. Sam drove with the window slightly open. Cold air moved across his face and dried his eyes. The metallic taste had faded into something dull, almost familiar. He no longer tried to name it. He left the interstate without planning to. A narrow road curved toward a small town whose name he did not read. The gas station at the corner stood open under harsh white light. He filled the tank slowly, listening to the click of the pump. Fuel flowed. Money changed hands. Motion would continue. Inside the station, a teenage clerk watched something on his phone and barely looked up. Sam bought a bottle of water and a pack of matches he did not need. The receipt printed with a thin mechanical sigh. He folded it once and placed it in his pocket beside nothing. Outside, a freight train passed beyond the dark line of trees. Its sound was deep and patient. Boxcars moved one after another, carrying weight toward places that would not remember them. Sam stood still until the last carriage disappeared. The rails kept humming for a moment longer. He returned to the truck, but did not start it immediately. Across the road stood a closed church with a wooden cross mounted above the door. The paint had peeled along its edges. It leaned slightly to one side. He looked at it without expectation. There was no message in it for him. Finally, he turned the key. The engine answered. He drove through the sleeping town at a steady speed, past dark windows and silent sidewalks. No one watched him leave. Ahead, the road dissolved into black distance. He followed it, not because it led somewhere, but because it existed. Zinc on the tongue. The parking lot held the night the way metal holds cold. Asphalt breathed out the heat it had swallowed all day, mixed with diesel and old rubber. Above it, the floodlights burned with a lifeless blue glare. Frank sat inside his old Ford, engine silent, listening to the ticking of cooling steel. It was the hour when silence thickened and settled on the shoulders. The shopping mall behind him looked less like a place for people and more like a warehouse where abandoned things waited for morning. Neon hummed over the nearest pole. Moths battered themselves against the glass with blind persistence. Their wings made a dry sound, like newspapers folded too many times. A half-smoked camel lay on the dashboard. Frank did not light it. He watched the dust instead, the fine gray layer that gathered each night, no matter how often he wiped it away. His security jacket hung too wide across the shoulders. At 3 o'clock, he walked the same path to the emergency exit and pulled the same locked handle. The door never changed its mind. On the asphalt lay a crushed Budweiser can. He nudged it with his boot. The hollow rattle traveled across the empty lot and returned to him thinner than before. The tire factory had closed 2 winters ago. Since then, his movements had become habits without purpose. A woman stood by the dark vending machines. Linda. She worked the late shift at the fast food place across the highway. They did not greet each other. Words would have sounded unnecessary under the lamps. She touched the cold glass of the storefront. Mannequins in discount shirts stared back at nothing. "They still fly into the light," she said quietly, watching the moths. "They think it's the sun," Frank answered. "It's just gas in a tube." It was not philosophy. It was inventory. In the distance, a shopping cart rolled loose in the wind, its wheels crying against the concrete. Frank watched it gather a little speed and overturn near the curb. He did not move to stop it. Dawn began as a thinning of darkness. Linda walked to her old Chevy. Frank finally lit a cigarette. The smoke tasted sharp, like zinc on the tongue. The moths dropped one by one onto the asphalt. Another night had passed. That was all. By the time the sky turned from black to a diluted gray, the lamps were still burning. They had not yet understood that morning had begun. Frank remained in the car and watched the light lose its authority. The parking lot looked wider in the half-dawn, as if night had been holding it together. Now the cracks in the asphalt were visible again, thin and branching like old scars. He felt them in his own hands when he flexed his fingers on the steering wheel. He stepped out and walked past the line of carts chained together near the entrance. One had broken loose during the wind and lay on its side where it had fallen. He lifted it without effort. The metal was colder than he expected. For a moment, he held it upright, steady, as if waiting for someone to claim it. No one came. He rolled it back to the others and hooked it into place. The small click of the chain sounded final. Inside the mall, the air was stale and faintly sweet from cleaning chemicals. The automatic doors opened for him with obedient indifference. His boots echoed across the polished tiles. In the glass of a closed jewelry store, he saw his reflection framed by neon signs advertising sales that had ended months ago. His face looked like something left in storage intact, but unused. At the far end of the corridor, a janitor pushed a wide mop in slow arcs. They nodded without stopping. The man's bucket left a thin, wet trail that caught the first weak light from the skylights above. It resembled a river on a faded map. Frank paused near the vending machines where Linda had stood. The glass still held the faint imprint of her hand. He touched the spot with his own palm. It had already cooled. Outside, traffic began to murmur on the highway. The world resumed its routine without asking who had endured the night. Frank returned to his Ford and sat once more behind the wheel. He did not start the engine. He waited for the lamps to switch off automatically. When they did, the parking lot lost its blue glow and became ordinary. The day did not promise anything. It simply replaced one kind of light with another. Morning settled without warmth. The sun rose pale behind a film of cloud, and the parking lot turned the color of old tin. Frank remained until the first customers began to arrive, women in sweatshirts, men with paper cups, engines idling like tired animals. He watched them drift toward the sliding doors with the quiet urgency of people who needed to buy something before the day decided what to take from them. At 7, he handed his badge to the day guard, a younger man with smooth hands and restless eyes. They exchanged no more than a nod. The night passed between them like a receipt unsigned, unexamined. Frank crossed the lot on foot. The air tasted faintly metallic, as if rain had fallen somewhere far off and changed its mind. He drove without direction at first, circling the outer road that bordered the empty fields beyond the mall. The fields had once held warehouses and plans. Now they held weeds and faded signs promising development. He parked near a chain-link fence and turned off the engine. The silence here was thinner, but more honest. No neon, no humming tubes pretending to be suns. From the glove compartment, he took out the old lighter again. The metal was scratched, dulled by years of pockets and forgotten drawers. He flicked it once. A small flame appeared, steady and indifferent. He held it until the heat reached his fingers, then closed it. The click sounded sharper in the open air. In the distance, trucks moved along the highway in a slow procession. Frank watched them and felt the weight of movement that was not his. Somewhere across town, Linda would be sleeping behind drawn curtains, the smell of fire oil still clinging to her hair. He imagined her hand against the vending machine glass. It seemed important that someone had stood there with him, even if nothing had changed. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the fields. Frank started the engine at last. The radio spoke in a bright voice about discounts and traffic updates. He turned it off. The road ahead was straight and empty. He drove toward it, not because it led somewhere, but because standing still had begun to feel like rust. He slept through most of the day in a small apartment. It faced another parking lot. The curtains were thin and let in a diluted light that flattened the furniture. The refrigerator hummed with the same patience as the neon at the mall. Frank lay on the couch without undressing. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old smoke. When he closed his eyes, he still saw moths striking glass. He woke before sunset. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. Then the weight returned, the badge on the table, the folded uniform on the chair. He washed his face in cold water and watched it run gray into the sink. The mirror gave him back a man who had not moved far in years. He shaved carefully, as if precision could replace intention. On the kitchen counter stood a framed photograph, turned slightly toward the wall. He straightened it without looking too long. A woman with patient eyes stood beside a younger version of himself in front of a small house. The grass in the picture was green and convinced of its own future. He set the frame down again. The apartment felt smaller after that. Outside, evening gathered quickly. He walked down the stairwell and felt the day thinning behind him. In the parking lot below, a child rode a bicycle in circles, tires whispering against concrete. The boy's laughter rose and disappeared between buildings. Frank paused, watching the careful balance, the stubborn insistence on motion. Then he turned away. The drive back to the mall followed the same road as always. Stores along the highway lit their signs one by one. The sky dimmed into the same shade of metal he had left that morning. When he reached the lot, the floodlights were already burning. They welcomed him without warmth. He parked in his usual place and cut the engine. The ticking began again. Night did not arrive dramatically. It resumed. The fifth night began with wind. It moved across the lot in low, steady breaths, pushing dust into narrow spirals between the painted lines. The floodlights trembled slightly in their cages. Frank stepped out of the Ford and locked it with a quiet click. The metal of the door felt colder than it should have. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and began his round. Near the entrance, a stack of shopping carts leaned against each other like tired men at a bar. One had a bent wheel that scraped the ground when moved. He pulled it aside and pushed it a few meters, listening to the uneven rhythm. The sound irritated him, but he did not know why. He left the cart near the curb and continued toward the back doors. The emergency exit resisted as always. He pulled the handle and felt the stubborn refusal through his palm. For a second, he imagined the door giving way, swinging open into some other kind of night one, without schedules or fluorescent ceilings. It remained closed. He released it and stood still, hearing only the wind and the distant pulse of traffic. When he reached the vending machines, he saw her again. Linda stood with her back against the wall, a paper cup in her hand. Steam rose faintly into the artificial light. "They cut our hours," she said, as if continuing a conversation from days ago. He nodded. They cut everything. They stood side by side without touching. The moths were fewer tonight, scattered against the neon like small stains. Linda took a sip from her cup and winced at the heat. "Ever think of leaving?" she asked. "Leaving for what?" She did not answer. The wind carried a loose receipt across the asphalt. It brushed against his boot and moved on. Frank watched it travel until it caught under a parked truck. He realized that the question had not been about geography. It had been about weight. He felt it settle again across his shoulders, familiar and exact. The night stretched ahead, measurable in hours. He checked his watch and resumed walking. Linda remained by the machines, her cup slowly emptying in her hands. The sixth night carried rain. Not a storm, only a steady fall that flattened the dust and darkened the asphalt into a dull sheen. The floodlights reflected in long, trembling lines. Frank stood beneath the awning near the entrance and watched the drops gather at the edge before falling in intervals. The air smelled cleaner, but colder. Water exposed where the dust had softened. His boots left wet prints across the tiles, just inside the doors. He paused to wipe them on the mat, though no one would notice. The mall echoed differently in rain. Sounds traveled farther, then dissolved. He walked the corridor past dark storefronts, where mannequins stood rigid in seasonal colors already out of season. In one window, a sign read "Final Clearance" in red letters that looked more tired than urgent. At the emergency exit, water seeped beneath the threshold. A thin line crept along the grout. He pressed the handle out of habit. The door held. For a moment, he imagined the rain pushing harder, flooding the corridors, washing away price tags and security cameras alike. The image felt almost gentle. When he stepped back outside, Linda was there again, her hair damp at the edges. She had no cup tonight. Rain gathered on her sleeves and darkened the fabric. "It's quieter in the rain," she said. "It hides the noise," he answered. They stood watching the parking lot become a mirror. A lone cart rolled slowly downhill, its wheels hissing through shallow water. It tipped at the curb and lay still. The rain softened the sound of its fall. Linda looked at him longer than usual. "I put in an application," she said. "Warehouse job. Day shift." He nodded once. "That's good." She did not smile. The word "good" had no surface to land on. After a while, she stepped back, lifting her face briefly toward the rain, as if testing it. Then she walked toward her car, her reflection stretching beside her in the wet asphalt. Frank remained under the awning. The rain continued without intention. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke dissolve into the damp air. The taste was less sharp tonight. When the shift ended, the clouds had thinned but not broken. Morning waited behind them, patient and without promise. The seventh night felt emptier, though nothing visible had changed. The rain had passed, leaving behind a brittle clarity. The asphalt shone faintly under the lamps, as if sealed in glass. Frank parked in the same place and waited a moment before stepping out. The ticking of the cooling engine sounded louder in the still air. He made his first round earlier than usual. The wind had stopped. Even the highway seemed distant, reduced to a low murmur. At the vending machines, there was no one. The glass reflected only his own outline and the pale flicker of fluorescent tubes behind him. He stood there longer than necessary, as if waiting for a delayed arrival that would not be announced. Inside, the corridors felt longer. His boots traced the familiar path across polished tiles. In the window of a closed electronics store, televisions played a loop of bright landscapes, oceans, mountains, smiling families beneath impossible sunsets. The images were sharp and saturated. He watched them without expression. The sound was muted. It was enough. At 3, he checked the emergency exit. The handle resisted with the same firm indifference. He held it a second longer this time, feeling the cold through his palm. Then he released it and rested his forehead briefly against the metal door. It carried no warmth. The gesture left no mark. Outside again, he found the bent shopping cart from earlier in the week. It had been pushed aside, but not repaired. He gripped the handle and began to move it across the lot. The wheels shrieked against the pavement. The noise cut through the silence, raw and unnecessary. He pushed it all the way to the far curb and tipped it onto its side. The sound of metal striking concrete echoed and faded. He stood there, breathing evenly. No one came to ask why. The lamps burned above him, indifferent suns in their steel cages. Somewhere beyond them all, the sky began to pale. He felt the absence beside the vending machines, like a missing fixture, nothing dramatic, just a space that no longer held its shape. When his shift ended, he did not look for a car. He sat in the Ford and watched the lights extinguish one by one. The parking lot returned to its natural color, drained of blue. For a moment, he imagined not coming back the next night. The thought was quiet and almost reasonable. He started the engine anyway. The 8th night arrived without ceremony. The air was dry again, carrying the faint odor of hot wiring and distant exhaust. Frank parked and remained seated longer than usual, hands resting on the wheel. The floodlights cast their pale circles across the lot. He waited for a feeling that did not come. He began his round slowly. Near the entrance, the row of carts stood aligned, corrected by someone from the day's shift. The bent one was gone. In its place was a newer cart, wheels silent, metal unscarred. He touched the handle as he passed. It gave nothing back. Inside, the mall felt prepared for something that would not happen. Seasonal banners hung from the ceiling, promising renewal, savings, beginnings. The letters were bright and without conviction. At the vending machines, the glass had been wiped clean. No trace of a hand remained. He saw only himself and the pale ceiling lights behind him. He checked the emergency exit. The handle resisted as always. This time he did not linger. He moved on to the rear corridor, where a delivery door opened briefly to admit a truck. A young driver stepped down, scanning paperwork under the dome light of his cab. For a second, Frank watched the man's quick movements, the impatience in his shoulders. The truck departed, leaving behind a rectangle of darkness that closed with a mechanical sigh. Near the far edge of the lot, he noticed a scrap of paper pinned under a stone. It had likely blown there days before. He picked it up. It was a receipt, ink already fading, listing items no one would remember buying. He folded it once and placed it in his pocket without knowing why. Toward morning, the sky lightened in a thin band over the highway. Traffic resumed its steady flow. Frank stood beneath the lamps and felt the night release him. There was no message in it, no warning, only the repetition of hours endured. He returned to his car and sat with the engine off, listening to the cooling silence, as if it might finally explain itself.